It's the year 1135, and Henry Beauclerc, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and youngest son of King William the Conqueror, dies some 15 years after his only legitimate son and heir, William Atheling. For a man so intent on solidifying his own family's hold on the throne, his last thoughts must have dwelt on his failure to do so. But to really gauge the gravity of the issue facing Henry's kingdom following his death, we need to go back to before the White Ship disaster that claimed his son. Henry had seized the throne of England in 1100 following the suspicious death of his elder brother William Rufus, and proceeded to cement his hold despite the inconvenient presence of his elder surviving brother, Robert Curthose. Such a move, however, may have gained Henry a crown, and eventually a duchy, but it also set a dangerous precedent. A precedent not lost on many of the top players in 1135. Robert Curthose was the eldest son of the Conqueror. What's more, he had accepted the kingly status of William Rufus conditionally, on the understanding that he would be his brother's heir. With Henry's opportunistic move in 1100, he had demonstrated that despite the existence of those arguably closer to the previous monarch in terms of precedence, what royal succession came down to, in the end, was force, and at least some blood ties to the previous king. King is a word used intentionally too, as one obvious candidate for Henry, and the one he eventually settled on, his only surviving legitimate child, Matilda, was a woman, and no woman in England or Normandy had ruled in her own right. But if ultimately the issue was not a deal-breaker for Henry, then few barons shared his enthusiasm. Matilda had been married to Henry V, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 1111, and even ruled for a time on her husband's behalf in northern Italy. She was educated as a girl in the German style of government, having left England in 1110, but had unexpectedly returned to the Anglo-Norman world in 1125. The marriage with Emperor Henry had proven barren, the Empress Matilda now free to marry again, and as only 23 years old at the time, she became a valuable piece in her father's foreign policy. Despite some overtures from princes within the empire, Henry had preferred a match with the son of Fulk, Count of Anjou. Anjou, to Normandy's south, had been a hostile player in the war against the French king. Henry's hold on Normandy had been challenged since he seized it after Tinchebray in 1106. Though Robert Curthose, Henry's elder brother and Duke of Normandy, had been defeated and captured, his son William Clito had fought Henry along with Louis the Fat at the Battle of Bremule. To mitigate the threat from the south, Henry had earlier matched his only legitimate son and heir, William Atheling, to Fulk's daughter, another Matilda. However, the White Ship disaster undid all of this, leaving a potentially aggressive southern neighbour. There was furthermore disagreement over the fate of Matilda's dowry, which threatened to escalate into conflict. A new marriage alliance was thus a natural step, though one quite disagreeable to Henry's daughter. Matilda likely saw the match as beneath her dignity as a former empress. Geoffrey was merely the heir of a count, and barely a teenager in 1127. Whereas Matilda was a mature and experienced former co-ruler. Yet, after some persuasion, she finally relented, travelled to Normandy in May of 1127 to be betrothed to the teenaged Geoffrey. For King Henry, the process was a resounding success. Through the next year, Fulk began preparations to depart for Jerusalem to marry Melisandre, daughter and heiress of Baldwin II, the king. Fulk left Anjou and his lands to the young Geoffrey, departing east in 1129. Meanwhile, Geoffrey was married to Matilda on 17th of June 1128 at Le Mans, King Henry having knighted his new son-in-law just a week before. The marriage proved rocky, the differences in personality perhaps exacerbating resentment that was already stoked by King Henry's uncertain commitments on some castles in southern Normandy that had been promised as a dowry to Geoffrey. Relations soured to the point where Matilda left for Normandy, the couple not being reconciled till 1131. Though, to King Henry's delight, a first grandson was born on 5th of March 1133. Following the birth of the couple's second son Geoffrey in 1134, relations deteriorated to the point of rebellion. King Henry had secured a southern alliance, however it was a delicate beast. Anjou and Normandy were always traditional rivals, and thus the prospect of the Count of Anjou possibly claiming both Normandy and England through right of his wife was anathema to the great barons of both regions. It appears Henry was careful to disabuse Geoffrey from any pretensions of rule or even co-rule. Matilda was emphasised as his heir, with any future male heirs from the perspective of the oaths of the 1120s probably being preferred. This Angevin dimension did not help matters in terms of Matilda's hopes for a smooth succession. Henry likely feared that handing over actual control of any castles in southern Normandy would simply enable Geoffrey's conquest of his ancestral lands while he was still alive. A fresh rebellion broke out in southern Normandy in 1135, a military confrontation that proved the old king's last. Matilda this time threw her support behind her husband, and the Angevins supported the rebels. On the wider matter of the succession, Matilda did arguably have one of the best claims to her father's crown. She was his only surviving legitimate child, carrying the all-important blood of the ancient House of Wessex for her mother. Like Henry himself, she could also claim legitimacy through porphyrogenita, or being born to the purple, that is, being born to the reigning monarch. Matilda had been born after Henry became king, just as Henry was born after his father's conquest of England, unlike his elder brothers. Furthermore, as aforementioned, Henry seemingly sealed the deal on January 1st, 1127, at a gathering of his barons in London following his Christmas court at Windsor. In attendance were King Henry, his new queen, still childless, and Matilda herself. One by one, the key players filed in front of them to swear to uphold Matilda's succession. Among these were William of Corbeil, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and presumably the man who would have the job of actually crowning Matilda when her time came. In addition, David, the King of Scots, added his personal pledge, and he would later prove indeed to be a staunch supporter. Next to swear, and most importantly given subsequent events, was Stephen of Blois, King Henry's nephew. First to swear among the lay nobility, it's undeniable that Stephen, who had narrowly escaped sharing William Aetheling's watery death in 1120, did pledge to uphold his cousin's path to the crown and duchy. Stephen was another possible, if distant, prospect that Henry may have considered in the years preceding his decision to settle on his daughter. Stephen was powerful and influential, but not really considered a political threat to his uncle Henry, given his status as a third son behind William and Theobald of Blois. Stephen was the third son of Adela, the daughter of William the Conqueror, so he could claim a tenuous connection to the Norman royal house through his famous grandfather. However, unlike Matilda, Stephen was not officially designated his uncle's heir, had other claimants above him, including his own brothers, Theobald and William. He was not born to the purple, and was not directly descended through a male line, which made him a distant prospect, if even one at all, for his uncle. Despite all of this, however, Stephen did have something going for him, his sex. In a world in which men ruled through military might, he was powerful, the Count of Boulogne, and had extensive landholdings in England. He was also popular and affable enough to make him a decent political operator. What's more, he did have a decent claim to the crown through his mother, and was, unlike, for example, Robert of Gloucester, King Henry's eldest son, legitimate. To further explain Stephen's subsequent usurpation of Matilda's throne following Henry's death, we must also briefly consider the recent history of the throne itself. Royal succession was just as much a matter of convenience as of force. The Conqueror himself, after all, seized the throne and had himself crowned just weeks later on Christmas Day of 1066, despite not really having any claim to the throne. William Rufus, too, was not solidly set as his father's successor, and set the familiar precedent of rushing to England to have himself crowned in 1087, following the Conqueror's death. Indeed, Henry I himself set the record and most glaring precedent by abandoning his brother's barely cold corpse in the New Forest, seizing the royal treasury in Winchester, before having himself crowned in London just days after his brother's demise. Stephen then recognised that two major elements were required to make a king in Norman England. Firstly, a force. Could the claimant back his move up with muscle and steel, but also, crucially, a coronation? Coronations were not events lightly done, and the process was a confirmatory and divine approval of the new monarch, not easily undone. If Stephen, or anybody else for that matter, with a good claim to the throne, could have themselves crowned, then the process would arguably be complete. Fortuitously for Stephen, not only did he have enough support and a claim to the throne for his grandfather, but he was also informed of his uncle's death first, in his seat of Boulogne, much earlier than Henry's actual heir Matilda, who was, as we've seen, with her husband Geoffrey in Anjou, much further south. Like Henry before him, Stephen was in a prime location to capitalise on the confusion of the succession if he moved quickly enough, and move swiftly he did, Boulogne being close to England. He landed near Dover around 5th December, though according to some accounts, both the Great Port and Canterbury were garrisoned with Robert of Gloucester's men and point blank refused him entry. Despite this, Stephen quickly moved to London, arriving around the 8th of December, just a week after the old king's death. The Londoners were particularly amenable to Stephen, given his position as Count of Boulogne. He controlled the all-important trade route to the continent, and was also accompanied by an armed contingent to concentrate minds further. The stars further aligned in Stephen's favour, given he then rode for Winchester to take the royal treasury, the city conveniently being under the control of his younger brother, Bishop of Winchester, Henry. It was here that Roger, Bishop of Salisbury, and the Lord Chancellor handed over the treasury to him. Despite some initial objections from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen and his supporters ultimately proved persuasive with the ironical argument that the peace and stability of the realm took precedence over any oaths previously taken. Using the logic that Henry had insisted on the oaths to Matilda in hopes of maintaining such peace, Stephen argued that a realm without a king brought about the very anarchy the old king had feared. The final plank in Stephen's case was Hugh Bigard. Bigard was the late king's steward, threw his weight behind Stephen's claim by swearing that Henry changed his mind near death and had nominated Stephen as his successor. So it was that Stephen of Blois was crowned King Stephen of England at a hastily arranged and sparsely attended ceremony at Westminster on December 22nd, 1135. However, though a coronation went a long way to solidifying a claim to the throne of England, the matter was far from closed, as across the Channel brooded Stephen's greatest threat in Matilda. For Matilda, the odds had been stacked against her. For starters, she was technically in rebellion against her father, supporting rebels against the royal army at the time of Henry's death. Furthermore, she had been much further south with her husband Geoffrey of Anjou in that county when it happened. Therefore news reached her much too late to act. Even if she had received the news, she was heavily pregnant and thus in no fit condition to travel, and this was her status during the tense early months of 1136. She was immobile, cut off, and now her birthright was slipping away from her as Stephen inevitably strengthened his position. But not everybody was on board with King Stephen's coup. A council of barons even met in Normandy around mid-December to discuss the succession, and was attended, among others, by Robert of Gloucester, the late king's eldest illegitimate son. Far from throwing their support behind Stephen, it was his elder brother, Theobald, Count of Blois and Champagne, who was held to be the rightful successor, given he was the elder brother. However, though Theobald was a major figure in northern Europe, it was Stephen who was closer to his uncle King Henry. William seems to have suffered from some mental defect and was passed over for the county of Blois in favour of Theobald. Meanwhile, Stephen was sent to England by his mother in hopes of gaining favour there. This proved correct, with Stephen receiving vast estates in both England and Normandy, including the honours of Aix and Lancaster, as well as the county of Mortagne in Normandy. Henry further arranged a great match for his nephew, marrying him to Matilda of Boulogne in 1125, rich heiress of that region, which was added to Stephen's resume with the union. Stephen's closeness to the old king, his lands and his reputation as a powerful and easygoing man allowed him to act as he did despite these moves to elevate Theobald. Likely to the surprise of most gathered in Normandy, Stephen's envoys arrived soon after, proclaiming he had the support of the English as their king. Theobald was obviously indignant at this presumption, but after calming sufficiently, saw the wisdom of having his own brother as king if he could not hold the throne himself. Most of the other barons present were simply relieved, in that they had a new lord of both Normandy and England, meaning no return to the divisive days of Henry and Robert, in which they had to please two lords for the lands they held in both places. Meanwhile, despite her likely rage at this blatant disregarding of their oaths, the Empress Matilda could do little to press her own claim. Yet, though crippled by pregnancy and likely the sickness often associated with its earlier stages, she did move north and occupy the strategic castle of Argentan, an administrative and trading crossroads in Normandy, from where she could receive the latest information on events. Geoffrey also moved north into Maine and secured 3 fortifications there to further strengthen their position. However, things still looked bleak. Matilda would be physically saddled by a pregnancy for months, while the political situation raced on. She had no route to England for a free port in Normandy, and nearly no political support. What's more, Geoffrey faced rebellion back in Anjou, further complicating matters. However, nearly no support was certainly not none. Despite the mass disregarding of the oath to uphold her claim, one very important man did act: David, King of Scots. Of course, this was just as likely a political move on David's part, given the traditional time for an attack from Scotland was during such times political upheaval. His invasion was mildly successful in that he captured several key castles, including Carlisle, Wark and Alnwick, even reaching as far south as Newcastle, which he captured by the end of January 1136. However, when David headed for Durham, he was finally headed off by Stephen's larger host. Newly enriched by his capture of the royal treasury, Stephen's force outnumbered David's and prompted his withdrawal north. David's incursion was more an act of political probing of the new English king than an overt display of loyalty to Matilda, at least at this stage. A treaty was concluded in which David retained Carlisle and his own son was recognised as Earl of Huntingdon, a title which David himself had held in right of his wife, who had been the daughter of Wulfioth, the last Anglo-Saxon earl who was executed in 1076. With David temporarily forestalled, Stephen celebrated Easter at Westminster. Most of the important barons submitted to him, with Theobald of Blois accepting his ascension as a fait accompli. Robert of Gloucester seemed lukewarm in his acceptance, as did Brian Fitzcount. Crucially, however, Stephen received papal support in a letter confirming his kingship from Pope Innocent II. But not all was quiet. A rebellion had broken out in the West Country under a certain Baldwin de Redvers, who held lands in Devon, Hampshire, the Isle of Wight, and also happened to be Castellan of Exeter Castle. Baldwin not only rejected Stephen as king, but claimed the castle for himself and the surrounding countryside. This was no political gesture either. Baldwin was stockpiling goods and now had Exeter Castle, which in theory he was only supposed to hold for the king, but was garrisoned with his own men. For Stephen, the path forward was clear. In no way could he allow such a challenge to his new dominion to go unanswered, and as such he gathered another host and marched west. He sent a vanguard of 200 horse before reaching the castle in June of 1136. Despite his presence at the walls, however, the garrison was unmoved. This left the new king little choice, and he surrounded the fortification and began a siege. In the event, the castle held out against the king for 3 months through the summer, despite Stephen trying everything to take it, as is described in the Deeds of Stephen. Quote, "Day and night he vigorously and energetically pressed on with the siege of the garrison. Sometimes he joined battle with them by means of armed men crawling up the rampart, sometimes by the aid of countless slingers, who had been hired from a distant region. He assailed them with an unendurable hail of stones, and at other times he summoned those who had skill in mining underground, and ordered them to search into the bowels of the earth, with a view to demolishing the walls. Frequently too, he devised engines of different sorts to shake and undermine the wall." But even with use of these siege engines, they had little effect, not being the huge behemoths of later times. The true victor was first. As the water supplies began to run out, the men of Exeter began substituting wine to drink, and even to bake bread with, but the result was inevitable. The siege had been expensive in money and time, as well as a flagrant display of disrespect to Stephen and to the crown, so naturally his advisors, and perhaps the defenders themselves, expected a harsh sentence following their surrender. Yet far from mutilating or killing any of them, Stephen simply allowed the garrison to leave with honour. This was extended to Baldwin's other castle, at Plympton. In fact, even Baldwin himself was allowed to go free. Such clemency was to be characteristic of Stephen's approach. It was a bad move, as Baldwin threw the gesture right back in Stephen's face by returning to the Isle of Wight, where he immediately stirred up more trouble, before ultimately fleeing into exile and into the arms of Geoffrey and Matilda in Anjou. Baldwin would remain among their most loyal supporters for years to come. Having defeated the rebellion of Baldwin de Redvers in Exeter during the summer of 1136, King Stephen moved to further legitimise his usurpation of Matilda's throne by meeting the ailing King Louis the Fat, nemesis of Stephen's late uncle, King Henry I, at the Battle of Brimieux. Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, was recognised and paid homage as Duke of Normandy. Stephen had received papal recognition of his ascension to the throne in Easter of 1136, and now the overt recognition of the King of France. However, if Stephen had felt secure in his position diplomatically, he had made a grave error of judgment at the conclusion of the siege of Exeter. Now it was known that a man could brazenly defy Stephen, not only live but go freely to raise yet more trouble, as had been the case of Baldwin. David, King of Scots, learned the lesson well and resolved once more to try his luck. The truce Stephen had secured in Durham expired in December of 1137, and it was now that David decided to act. On the pretext of reopening the question of his claim to the title of Earl of Northumbria, David sent envoys to Stephen, who had newly returned from Normandy. Predictably, this notion was rejected out of hand by Stephen, and thus provided the sufficient excuse for David to invade, along with his son Henry. David's previous invasion had been quickly devised as a sort of smash and grab into England while it was still vulnerable. If it had been for the noble purpose of merely upholding Matilda's claim to the throne, then David had probably expected a swift response from Anjou in the retaking of Normandy and perhaps a mass swearing of fealty to Matilda. But neither of these things had materialised, so it was no surprise David had settled with Stephen in early 1136. However, like Stephen at Exeter, David was bogged down in a siege of Warwick Castle for several weeks, while his troops ravaged the lands of Northumberland and the county of Durham. The deeds of Stephen describes the Scots thus, quote, "They were barbarous and filthy, neither overcome by excess of cold, nor enfeebled by severe hunger, putting their trust in swiftness of foot and light equipment. Among foreigners they surpass all in cruelty." For Stephen, this was yet another major challenge to his credibility as king. Could he prove his mettle as a warrior? Could he protect his subjects, the most basic role of the monarch? He moved quickly, reaching the area desolated by David's troops by February of 1138. Retaking the initiative, instead of responding directly to David, Stephen bypassed the King of Scots and began laying waste to the region of Lothian. This had the effect of drawing David back north for a time, but with scant supplies, and in the middle of winter, Stephen was not willing to go the extra mile and offer battle. David resumed his raiding of Northumberland and Durham throughout the April of 1138. Stephen's brief response was not what had been expected. Hostilities continued without him into the summer, with David even scoring a victory at Clitheroe in June, before resuming the siege of Warwick, which was somewhat less successful. King Stephen's luck began to worsen. A rebellion had broken out in Herefordshire and Shropshire, perhaps the earlier meek treatment of the rebels of Exeter bearing more of its rotten fruit. David too was growing in strength, as he had received a northern lord into his patronage. With Eustace Fitzjohn came the castles of Alnwick and Malton, and a decided increase in the Scots' strength. However, despite Stephen's absence and the disunity of the northern barons, one unlikely hero did emerge for the English: Thurstan, Archbishop of York. He was already of sufficient advanced age that he could not swap his robes for mail, and instead sent a northern coalition up the Great Northern Road to confront the invaders. In the English force was a wagon housing a great mast, attached to which were the banners of St. Peter, to whom York Minster was dedicated, St. John of Beverley, and St. Wilfrid of Ripon, all important local saints. The army advanced to Thirsk, where they were joined, interestingly enough, by mercenaries under Robert de Bruce and Bernard de Baliol. Bruce, yes, the ancestor of that Bruce, led negotiations with David, offering to promise the securing of the defunct earldom of Northumbria for his son Henry if the king withdrew. However, the meeting soon broke up angrily, and Robert returned to his troops, withdrawing his homage to the King of Scots. David, meanwhile, crossed the Tees River, and the English moved northwards to take up the defensive position near a place called Northallerton. The Scots, for once, outnumbered their southern foes, with around 16,000 men to their 10,000. The English forces arrayed themselves along a ridge a couple of miles north of Northallerton in a single battle or line of men. The English knights chose to dismount, a good defensive tactic for the terrain, and a tactic similarly adopted at King Henry's battles of Tinchebray and Bremure. In the front of the formation were the more lightly armed levies, with archer support, yet the nobles situated themselves with the dismounted and heavily armoured knights at the centre, coalescing around the great standard. The Scots, by contrast, had divided themselves into four lines, the first composed of Galwegians, armed with long knives and throwing spears. The second was made up of Prince Henry, who had a mixture of knights, archers, and men from Cumbria and others. The third line was mostly made up of Lothians, with the final line commanded by King David himself and composed of knights as his bodyguard and some Scots infantry. The battle proper began with a charge from David's first line of Galwegians, which, while initially successful in driving back the levies of the English line, was not so effective against the knights of the centre. Screaming their battle cries, throwing themselves bravely against the thick mass of iron spears and swords, the Scottish attack petered out, with the English archers causing large gaps to appear in their lines. The breaking point came when both the Galwegians and Lothians lost their leaders. By this point, David's line was becoming progressively thinner with desertion, and the king himself was forced onto a horse and led from the field as the enormity of the losses became apparent. Despite this, however, Prince Henry did advance with some mounted men, perhaps a little too late, as the first Scottish attack melted away. This charge was actually very successful, even smashing through the English line to the horses in the rear left by the dismounted English knights. However, it was largely unsupported, and with rumours now circulating across the field that the King of Scots himself was dead, he wasn't. The charge faltered completely against the momentum of an English counterattack. It was now that Prince Henry ordered his banners put away, and, to save himself and his men, he feigned pursuit among the English knights who chased the fleeing Scots. Mingling amongst them, he caught back up with his father and withdrew. The battle then was a disaster for the Scots, with a huge loss of around 12,000 men, compared to an unknown but relatively light English loss. It had taken no more than around 3 hours from daybreak for the Scottish invasion to be decisively crushed. David himself withdrew to Carlisle Castle, yet the English did not pursue him, and so he retained his gains from his previous campaigning. David was eventually brought to terms, with his son Henry negotiating with Stephen's queen, another Matilda, and King David's niece. David was actually quite fortunate considering his loss. His son Henry was still recognised as Earl of Northumbria and Huntingdon. David too was granted Cumbria and Carlisle in exchange for his recognition and support for the new King Stephen. Amazingly then, Stephen had once again flinched in the face of victory. Northern England would remain under Scottish rule for years to come, yet not play any significant role in the coming civil war between Stephen and Matilda. This may have been what Stephen had intended, perhaps plotting to reverse this situation later on. Previously we focused on the early years of King Stephen's tumultuous reign. The years of 1135 to 38 can be fairly characterised as mixed in fortunes for the new king. He had successfully claimed the throne over his cousin, the Empress Matilda. He had secured papal and French recognition, as well as undergoing the crucial coronation, yet rebellion and invasion rocked the realm. In 1138, a northern army, under the nominal leadership of the aged Thurstan, Archbishop of York, had defeated a larger Scots army near Northallerton. But despite this, Stephen had agreed through treaty that David, King of Scots, would retain effective control over the north. Wales had erupted soon after King Henry's death in December of 1135. Initial victory in battle during January of 1136 was followed by the ambush of Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare in April. Rebellion spread rapidly across South Wales during 1137, and by year's end Stephen appears to have abandoned any attempt at resolution there. He did stamp out rebellions in the West Country and in Shropshire during 1136, yet it was in Normandy that his deeper concerns lay. Geoffrey of Anjou invaded early in the same year, with his wife the Empress Matilda firmly in control of Argentan and its surrounding territory. A temporary truce forestalled the Angevin advance, but fighting would resume the same year, prompting the new king himself to attempt an intervention. Up to this point, Stephen had been lucky to the extent that opposition to him had been disjointed, yet 1137 would prove damaging to his cause, as well as invigorating to Matilda's. Matilda had been relatively inactive in the Argentan region since Stephen's usurpation in December of 1135. Her husband Geoffrey was far more interested in focusing his efforts on pressing their claims in Normandy than in pouring their resources into a war in England he would likely lose. Up to this point, no major noble had openly declared for Matilda. True, David, the King of Scots, invaded, but this was largely done for his own territorial ambitions. 1137 proved a crucial year, transforming the Angevin cause to a cross-channel affair. The man who truly began the civil war in England was Matilda's half-brother, Robert of Gloucester. Robert initially, if reluctantly, accepted Stephen's grab for power, though he had been one of those for his elder brother Theobald. Robert attended King Stephen's Easter Court of 1136 and had even accompanied him on his campaign to Exeter, though the two men never quite saw eye to eye. Robert's declaration for Matilda in 1138 changed everything. But why had this powerful magnate, who the new king had confirmed in his estates, chosen to throw his lot in with a pretender? William of Malmesbury, though perhaps biased towards Robert, suggests the catalyst was the king's attempted ambush of Robert. Robert, though, may have been discontented with Stephen from the start. He may have resented the new king's trust in other men at court, including William of Ypres as well as the Beaumonts. However, even before the alleged ambush attempt, Robert and Stephen had quarrelled over their respective status at the time of making their oaths to Matilda. Both men too were favourites of the previous king. Henry had granted Stephen vast estates and matched his nephew with Matilda, Countess of Boulogne, in 1125. Yet Robert, as King Henry's eldest illegitimate son, was equally honoured, being created Earl of Gloucester in the early 1120s and arranging a similarly prestigious marriage with Mabel Fitzrobert, which along with the honour of Gloucester also brought Glamorgan in the Welsh territory and land in Normandy itself. The latter land would prove valuable to the Angevin cause, given either Robert was a native of Caen or possibly the city's constable, providing a sea route to England later on. During 1136-7 though, Robert was loyal, if shaky, in his commitment to Stephen, though we can safely dispense with the notion, advanced by William of Malmesbury, that the Earl had always intended to desert to Matilda. Robert was at Stephen's side during his Exeter campaign, and had even accompanied him to Normandy in 1137 to fight Geoffrey, actions not likely if he had always intended to desert. Geoffrey had made inroads into southern Normandy during 1136, though was blocked by the efforts of Theobald and Waleran de Beaumont. Stephen's efforts in Normandy initially went well, with the king forming an informal alliance with the French king against Geoffrey, though his failed attempt to wrest back control of Argentan from him was as much down to his own failings as anything else. Arguments between the Norman and Flemish contingents of Stephen's army forestalled any action against Geoffrey. Robert particularly objected to the king's trust in William of Ypres, whom many barons resented given his relatively low-born status. William, like Robert, was an illegitimate son and directly related to a Count of Flanders, and though failing twice to take the title himself, would serve as Stephen's chief military lieutenant in the coming war. Robert's anger at William's prominence began to translate into open rumours that he was on the brink of defection. This allegedly caused Stephen to instruct William to prevent this, giving rise to the failed ambush attempt that, in itself, caused Robert to openly declare for Matilda. In 1138, Robert issued a defiance, renouncing his allegiance to Stephen and sending representatives out to spread the word, claiming that his actions were just, given Stephen had illegitimately claimed the throne and betrayed all faith sworn to him. Robert's public rejection of Stephen was an effective declaration of war. Now Robert had no choice but to fully commit to the Angevin cause, given his only hope of retaining his lands and power was to bring about Stephen's fall. On September 21st of 1136, Geoffrey invaded Normandy. His force besieged Carouges, taking it in 3 days, before moving on and taking and burning other places while approaching Lisieux. Waleran de Beaumont led the field army that faced the approaching Angevins near Lisieux, but at their approach instead burnt the town to deny it to Geoffrey. Geoffrey rerouted his advance towards Les Sables. Fires here were set by both sides, with the village church of St. Peter destroyed, yet the castle itself was stormed and its garrison overwhelmed. Yet despite these successes, local resistance proved strong, the Angevins bitterly condemned by the local populace for atrocities. According to Orderic Vitalis, Geoffrey did try to limit this destruction, found it hard to control his men, prompting local vigilantes to snipe at, sometimes pick off, Geoffrey's men. The breaking point came on October 1st, when Geoffrey himself was wounded by a javelin, piercing his right foot at Les Sables. Unluckily for her, his wife, the Empress Matilda, arrived just too late with reinforcements, as at dawn on October 2nd, Geoffrey decided to retreat home. The Angevin host was spent, given not only was its commander badly wounded, but its ranks riven with dysentery, though Orderic's vivid account of the Angevins feasting on uncooked food and leaving a literal trail as they retreated south can probably be ignored, given the speed and thus discipline of the withdrawal. Towards the end of March 1137, King Stephen himself entered the theatre. As we have seen, Stephen raised a large number of Flemish mercenaries. Good news greeted the king in terms of eroding Geoffrey's power in the region. William, Duke of Aquitaine, had made terms with Louis VI, arranging the marriage of his daughter Eleanor to his son. His death soon afterwards thus denied Geoffrey a key ally. Stephen meanwhile moved to take strongholds under the control of the rebellious Rabel de Tancarville. Stephen then attacked the castle, thus pacifying the region for a time. Next on his to-do list was to meet with his disgruntled elder brother Theobald, who had had his chance of kingship snatched from under him in December of 1135. With his younger brother's accession also came the loss of Normandy. Meeting at Evreux, Theobald agreed to lay aside his claims for a pension. The king had similar success with the ageing Louis the Fat, meeting him on the border and arranging for his son Eustace to do homage to Louis for Normandy, thus settling the matter of his suzerainty there too. Yet if things had gone great to begin with, events would soon show fortune's wheel had turned. Geoffrey was back, invading once more in May of 1137 with an even larger army. Geoffrey's advance prompted monasteries to pay for protection, a fact that undermined Stephen's authority. However, while Stephen talked, his man William of Ypres sought an engagement. William, though, lacked Norman support and returned to Stephen. They marched together towards Lisieux, where they hoped to bring Geoffrey himself to battle. It was near their destination that an incident erupted into a brawl, with one of the Flemings stealing a barrel of wine belonging to the squire of a Norman lord, Hugh of Gonnet. Infighting even resulted in men on both sides dying, and was more than enough for the Norman lords present to march off without a word to the king. Stephen managed to persuade some to return, but it must have been clear that such a divided force could not face Geoffrey on the battlefield. The king, unspectacularly, agreed a 3-year truce with the count, agreeing to pay Geoffrey a pension for peace. Though an inglorious end to events, Stephen's time in Normandy was far from a failure. He had made agreements with both Theobald and the French king, as well as stamped out local rebels in his duchy, while also staving off the Angevin threat for now, at least. This was just as well. Robert's defection, as we have noted, was important, but we must also consider Matilda's wider support. 2 other prominent men threw in their lot with the Empress, Miles of Gloucester and Brian Fitzcount. Both of these men had connections with Robert, but were also personally loyal to Matilda. Brian was likely the illegitimate son of Alan IV, Duke of Brittany, and was an intelligent and able lieutenant, even authoring a work justifying his support of Matilda, which has sadly been lost. Like many major figures of the period, his fortune too was made under Henry I. Henry had arranged a good match for him, with the heiress Matilda Wallingford. He held the honour of Wallingford, as well as being Lord of Abergavenny in Wales. He had even escorted Matilda herself in May of 1127 on her journey to Rouen in preparation for her marriage to Geoffrey along with Robert. Like Robert, it appears Brian had unenthusiastically accepted Stephen's rise, but had always been ready to enforce Matilda's claim when she acted on it. Interestingly, a charter of Matilda even refers to the, quote, love and loyal service of Brian. Yet though some have hinted that this attachment went way beyond into the realms of romantic love, we can never truly know this for sure, and, even if so, it could never formally be reciprocated. The third man of the major triumvirate of Matilda's support is Miles of Gloucester. Miles is intriguing in that he appears to have no overt reason to have sided against Stephen. The new king had in fact confirmed him in his lands and offices, including as Sheriff of Gloucester, and had even given Gloucester Castle to him to hold, perhaps hoping he would be a good counterbalance to Robert. Though Miles had no solid connection to Matilda herself, it has been noted in the Gesta Stephani that he was, quote, unquestioning in his loyalty to King Henry's children. It's safe to assume, despite his bias towards Robert, that William of Malmesbury was correct in noting that Robert had been canvassing support before he had made his own move in 1138, even if he hadn't always intended to side with Matilda, which may have included talks with these men. Matilda's support was thus centred initially around this trio, all of whom had extensive interests and lands in Wales, which, as we have seen, Stephen had bowed out of. A relatively small group of barons in her camp were geographically concentrated in Wales and the West Country, making mutual support possible, with all 3 men, and Miles in particular, being decent military commanders. Stephen definitely had much broader, if unenthusiastic support. He was the anointed and crowned King of England, had French and papal recognition, and therefore any military action against him was, by the standards of the time, rebellion, and so legally and morally unacceptable. This may have provoked many barons to remain at court, but not necessarily to fight with vigour. Stephen apparently relied on support from established magnates, as opposed to promoting new men, as had been the case in his uncle's court. Stephen tended to promote men whose power was already a reality, unlike Henry, who preferred men of relatively unimportant or minor noble rank. In time though, one man would emerge as the king's chief military man, and he was not an earl, William of Ypres. William would effectively be the Earl of Kent during Stephen's reign, but his aforementioned status may have been the reason why this was never formalised. His position at Stephen's side already causing major resentment, and arguably Robert's open defection to Matilda. As well as William, Stephen also favoured the twin sons of Robert, Count of Milan, and their relatives. Robert had been yet another beneficiary of King Henry's reign, with his vast estates being divided between Robert, who became the Earl of Leicester, and Waleran, who succeeded as Count of Milan. A younger brother, Hugh, was raised as Earl of Bedford in 1137, with their cousin Roger having been Earl of Warwick since 1119. Add to this web a series of important ecclesiastical posts, and you have a fairly solid base of support. The Earldom of Worcester was added to Waleran's portfolio in 1138, and the twins' mother had even remarried the Earl of Surrey, choosing a son who would succeed as William, Earl of Surrey. The Beaumont family may have provided a broad support earlier on, but they were not especially exceptional militarily, with the war effort for the Blessevin camp primarily led by William and the king himself. Like William, they also proved a nexus of jealousy for other important men. Robert, as we have seen, disapproved of their influence, as well as William's, but Roger, Bishop of Salisbury and chief of King Henry's administration, as well as Henry of Blois, Stephen's scheming brother, were also detractors. The church proved a toxic brew for Stephen. He had secured initial support for his coronation in December of 1135, yet William of Corbel died in 1136, presenting a tempting prospect for ambitious men. It's thought that Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester and key supporter of Stephen's rise, coveted the archbishopric. However, Stephen wisely threw his support behind another man, Theobald, Abbot of Bec. This may have proved both a good and bad move on Stephen's part, given subsequent events. Aside from his brother's ambitions, Stephen did serious damage to his standing with the church in 1139 by arresting 3 bishops, those of Salisbury, Ely and Lincoln. This trio was in effective control of King Henry's administration by the old king's death, and though they stood aside for Stephen's rise, the new king distrusted them nonetheless. They were likely involved in, or at least aware of, Robert of Gloucester's conspiracy of 1138-9. The Jester Stephani states that Roger of Salisbury, quote, was suspected of betraying his king and lord and giving support to the Angevin party. Between them, they had a series of formidable castles and a following that presented a threat to Stephen. Stephen spun the arrests as a secular act against holders of castles and not the men themselves as bishops, which seems to have worked given the papacy, generally friendly to him, took no action. Their leader was Roger, Bishop of Salisbury. Roger had risen from a poor priest at Caen in Normandy to become head of King Henry's administrators, and was made Bishop of Salisbury early on in the reign in 1101, rising to the pinnacle of power by even acting as Henry's regent at times when the king was absent in Normandy. It is known that in 1139 he had a mistress, another Matilda of Ramsbury, who held Devizes Castle on his behalf. The couple even had a bastard son, Roger, who was similarly an administrator. The 2 other bishops were similarly related to Roger, both men nephews as the sons of Humphrey, Roger's brother. They too had risen to archdeaconries in Salisbury before promotion to their bishoprics. The group effectively ran King Henry's administration and became very rich out of it. With this power came some important castles and followings, including Sherborne, Devizes, Malmesbury, Salisbury, Ely, Sleaford and Newark. Given new regimes always tend to see a changing of the guard, Roger and his network may have seen Stephen as a threat to their positions, and indeed may have seen Matilda as an attractive alternative. Waleran of Moulins was the leader of the opposition when it came to Roger's party, arguing the group was stockpiling weapons and men in their strongholds, conspiring with Robert to hand over these castles on Matilda's arrival. In any event, an assembly was summoned to Oxford in June of 1139, with the trio of bishops attending. While details are sketchy, a brawl appears to have broken out between Roger's men and another baron over lodgings, which may have involved the Beaumont twins. The fighting was bloody, though Roger's men got the best of it. Stephen pounced, arguing the peace of his court had been broken, demanded certain castles from the bishops to guarantee their good behaviour. They refused, obviously, with Stephen seizing Roger and Alexander of Lincoln there and then. Nigel, the Bishop of Ely, was lodging in a nearby village and managed to escape to Devizes, even devastating the land around it. This action alone appears to confirm involvement in a conspiracy, given this stronghold is a little a ways from Oxford and in the West Country, as well as being held for Roger and not him. Stephen pursued Nigel to Devizes with Bishop Roger in tow. The castles of Salisbury, Sherborne and Malmesbury were all surrendered to Stephen, but Devizes prepared to resist. In an uncharacteristic move, the king secured it by threatening to hang Roger the Poor, son of Bishop Roger and Matilda of Ramsbury, who held the castle for him. Gallows were erected and the rope fastened around his neck, full view of the castle, which prompted Matilda's capitulation. Bishop Alexander gave up the keys to Newark and Sleaford castles after Stephen threatened him with starvation. The acts prompted a likely bitter Henry of Blois to publicly condemn his royal brother, claiming, quote, "It was not for the king to judge them, but for the canon law." At a meeting in Winchester, Henry tried to get a general condemnation of his brother, though Stephen sent Aubrey de Vere, who convincingly argued that the bishops had caused trouble at court before and attended with armed escorts. Aubrey openly accused Roger of conspiracy with Matilda's party. The Archbishop of Rouen then arrived and weighed in, taking the king's part and arguing that the bishops had no defence by canon law for holding their castles, and that Stephen should rightfully hold them. In the event, Stephen did break the power of these men, with Roger emerging a broken man from proceedings. Bishop Alexander proved loyal to Stephen, though at least Nigel would prove the king right to suspect them, the bishop biding his time before openly declaring for the Angevins. This incident then proved a key move for Stephen, removing a potential military political threat. He now held the key castles, formerly under their control, and began to remould the administrative structure and appoint new sheriffs outside of Roger's orbit. Yet if Stephen was justified in removing Roger of Salisbury from power, there were other men who acted in favour of the Angevin cause. Around about the time of Robert's defiance, a series of rebellions broke out across the western country. Geoffrey Talbot took and eventually burned Hereford, before eventually regrouping in Bristol and attempting to seize Bath. He was initially captured in the fighting, but was eventually released when the Bishop of Bath was also captured and swapped for him. 4 castles on the Welsh border, namely Whittington, Burn, Overton and Ellesmere, were all held in defiance of Stephen by William Peveril, but were all eventually subdued by the king. Shrewsbury too revolted under William Fitzalan, who was nephew by marriage to Robert of Gloucester, having married his niece, Christina. Shrewsbury was besieged in August and eventually stormed. At Shrewsbury, Stephen chose to act ruthlessly, having all 93 men of the garrison and its commander, Arnulf de Hesdin, hanged. Another series of strongholds joined the revolt. It's no coincidence that this defiance happened to coincide with Robert's own and any sphere of influence in the West Country. A major hub of resistance was Bristol. Stephen chose to remain in the west, while his wife and queen, Matilda, dealt with Dover, similarly held by Robert's men. Castle Carry was starved into submission, with the king setting up engines and lobbing fire and stone into it too. His speed was unexpected. With food already scant, the garrison surrendered on terms. Harptree too was a victim of both Stephen's speed and guile. Moving past it en route to Bristol, the garrison sallied out to shadow Stephen's army, hoping to attack his flank unawares. They were instead themselves taken unawares, as Stephen sent a cavalry force to attack the castle, burning its gates, scaling its walls with ladders, and overwhelming the rump of the garrison. The castles of William Peveril, as well as Wareham, were also taken. Meanwhile, Dover was completely cut off by Queen Matilda, the Queen having blockaded the castle by land and sent to her native Boulogne to cut it off by sea. However, in the end, this formidable stronghold was not taken by force, but by persuasion. The castle was held by Walkelin Mamonot, and Stephen sent his father-in-law, Robert of Ferrieres, to get him to yield, the former perhaps persuaded to do so by news of Stephen's harsh treatment of the men of Shrewsbury. With the defeat of another rebel, William de Mohun, and Stephen's forces having reduced all the strongholds around Bristol, thus isolating the place, Stephen had proven a capable military commander. The small-scale rebellions of 1138-9 had been dealt with, and may very well have been launched in expectation of aid, or even the landing of Earl Robert himself. Robert likely had to settle matters in Normandy, and consolidate and plan with the Empress before committing to a landing in England. Whatever the reasons, Robert's delay proved costly, the king having reduced all of his lands and support bar Bristol. Yet 1139 truly opened up the war to a full-blown succession crisis, whereas before it had been small-scale revolts, at least in England anyway, and acts of defiance. Ahead of Robert and Matilda went the irascible Baldwin de Redvers, who landed in Wareham, Dorset, and immediately moved to occupy Corfe Castle, which had the desired effect, drawing King Stephen away from the southeast. Matilda and Robert arrived on 30th of September at Arundel with a host of 140 knights, 3,000 foot. They were received by Adeliza, the widow of her late father, King Henry I. The two women were actually similarly aged and on friendly terms, despite the latter's childlessness with Henry. On the surface, Matilda's landing at Arundel is a clear act of war, given subsequent events, but at the time there was actually nothing illegal or threatening Matilda visiting her stepmother in and of itself. Adeliza had even formally invited her, making it even more normal looking. That the Empress was a woman did offer its own disadvantages in terms of the succession, but it had also afforded her certain privileges. Stephen had no proper grounds for arresting or ill-treating her at this time. To us, what happens next seems silly, but through contemporary eyes, the situation was actually very delicate. With Robert absent, which we'll get to momentarily, it was not a good look for Stephen, King of England, to be seen attacking the wife and daughter of the previous king. Robert had no such privilege, having openly declared war, and did not delay upon landing, and immediately set off with a dozen knights to seize his stronghold of Bristol, some 120 miles away. But Stephen moved equally as quick, having been informed of Baldwin's earlier invasion and occupation of Corfe. He had initially moved there, perhaps cursing his early leniency at Exeter, but he did not allow himself to be pinned in place, conducting a protracted siege. Instead, he built a retaining wall around the stronghold to prevent Baldwin's men sallying out, and left the siege in the hands of lieutenants, before moving on Arundel. Matilda had not been present for more than a week before Stephen had her trapped in the castle. It's likely that Stephen considered Robert the true threat, though with the Earl slipping by to Bristol, he now focused fully on Matilda. For Matilda, defeat stared her squarely in the face. Her options were limited. She had a sizable force with her, but Arundel was not her castle to defend. Adeliza was a friend, but her husband, William de Albini, was a supporter of Stephen. If it came to a siege, which was unlikely, the prospects were dim. Matilda could retreat back to the sea, but with all the other ports on the south coast held by Stephen, this would probably involve an ignominious retreat back to Normandy. If she was given up or taken, then she could probably expect a lifelong captivity, much like her uncle Robert Curthose, who had been captured during the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. In the event, it was Adeliza who saved the day. She could not openly defy Stephen as her anointed king, but she did not strictly need to. Technically, Matilda's presence was not treason. She was merely offering hospitality to Matilda, her stepdaughter. As we've already seen, this was not a solid foundation for hostile action on the king's part. Now it was Stephen who was trapped. If he called Adeliza's bluff, then the implication was that he was calling her, the Queen Dowager, a liar. It also didn't look great from what we would call a public relations standpoint, for Stephen to attack a distinguished highborn woman like Matilda, not to mention the Dowager Queen, who, after Stephen's own wife, was the highest ranking noble lady in the realm. Starving or possibly harming these ladies was not a good look, and kings relied on the support of their barons who may not want to associate themselves with a king who threatens and attacks highborn ladies. For once then, Matilda's sex actually worked for her, yet this impasse could not endure indefinitely, and it didn't. Remarkably, one man had two opportunities to sway events away from the war that would come. Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, and the king's own dear little brother, had in fact anticipated such a move from Robert, and, according to the Jester Stephani, had watchers on the smaller roads used by the Earl to reach Bristol. One such guard encountered Robert, thus giving Henry a golden opportunity to end the war before it had truly begun. However, despite having the Earl at his mercy, Henry, quote, after a compact of peace and friendship had been firmly ratified between them, let Robert go unharmed. Meanwhile, Stephen knew Matilda was a threat, if a lesser one to her half-brother, but had no concrete excuse to attack Arundel. Amazingly, and perhaps disastrously for the people of England, a compromise was struck, and the man behind it was none other than Henry of Blois. The same source suggests that the king, despite the aforementioned concerns, was still all for besieging Arundel, but that Henry had persuaded Stephen that the better move would be to allow the Empress to leave, join her brother. Matilda would be allowed safe passage to Robert in Bristol. On the surface, it once again seems Stephen allowed victory to slip through his fingers, but is this necessarily so? Even Henry, who likely still smarted from being overlooked, rightly so, as Archbishop of Canterbury, and even opposed his brother over the bishops, saw Robert, not Matilda, as the true threat, and even said so, arguing the king should focus on capturing or killing Robert. Since the Earl had already slipped through Stephen's grasp, what benefit would be reaped in harming his half-sister, who was, from a military standpoint, irrelevant? This was likely a known quantity to all involved anyway, and would explain Robert's actions in quickly rushing out of Arundel to his own lands, whilst leaving his half-sister in Arundel. All concerned then knew Robert was the real threat. The agreement brokered at Arundel was the best of a poor situation for the king, a truce granted for both political and military reasons. If Robert had been caught or similarly trapped in Arundel, or anywhere else for that matter, along with Matilda or not, then it's a safe bet a siege would have been a certainty. Details of the agreement are sadly lost, but in essence it allowed for Matilda to ride west to Robert under escort, and in the company of the king's brother, Henry of Blois. Stephen may have gained some kind of promise from Matilda herself she would not war against him, but this seems unlikely, and was broken if so. What Stephen did gain from the whole incident is the kudos of playing the chivalrous king. What's more, Arundel was considered impregnable, and thus Matilda's withdrawal avoided a potentially protracted, embarrassing and bloody siege, with all the political consequences causing harm to two high-ranking noble ladies that came with it. Being pinned down at Arundel while Robert roamed freely in the west was also not wise. Matilda thus rode out of Arundel in the company of Henry and Waleron de Beaumont, eventually meeting Robert himself at an agreed boundary. Yet even with the Empress's escape and Robert free in Bristol, the Earl must have been disappointed at the turnout of support. He was still the only major baron to throw his weight behind the Empress. By 1139 then, the lines had decidedly been drawn, with the Angevins confined to a compact region around Gloucester and Bristol, stretching north into southern Wales, and south to southwest into Cornwall and Devon, stretching east as far as Wallingford and Oxford. Matilda herself established her court in Gloucester, close enough to Robert's main stronghold of Bristol, but without being totally under his control. In contrast, the castle of Wallingford lay at the frontier of Angevin territory and was King Stephen's first target. Despite Stephen's admirable resolve and energy, this target was ambitious. The surviving foundations suggest Wallingford was a powerful structure, and indeed it proved so, with Stephen never taking the castle. Instead, the king decided to blockade it by building 2 counter-fortifications and leaving a rearguard while he moved on to Trowbridge. This advance was initially successful, with the king taking the castles of South Cerney and Malmesbury en route. However, Miles of Gloucester proved why he was the Angevins' best captain by cutting across Stephen's rear and attacking the besieging army at Wallingford. This action was a stunning success, Miles taking the Blessevins by surprise, killing and capturing many. Unlike the initial rebellions, Stephen must have realised he was dealing with more than isolated minor lords. It was obvious this would not be a quick conflict. The Angevin strongholds were just too strong, and it was unlikely that they would be drawn into a decisive battle. What's more, now Miles threatened London, so Stephen withdrew to nullify the threat. In November of 1139, an army marching out of Gloucester attacked Worcester. The attack began on the 7th, the castle garrison resisting fiercely. The first assault was barely beaten back, though a second on the north walls proved successful, with the Angevins burning much of the town, carrying off loot, captives to be ransomed. Despite some raids by the king in the region around Bristol and Hereford, it was clear by the end of 1139 that the Angevin push into England had been successful. William of Malmesbury sums up the situation, quote, "So the whole district around Gloucester, far into Wales, partly through force and partly from goodwill, gradually went over to the Lady Empress in the remaining months of the year." Commenting on the year of 1140, William states, quote, "There were many castles all over England, each defending its own district, or rather plundering it. The knights from the castles carried off both herds and flocks, sparing neither churches nor graveyards, pillaging the dwellings of the wretched countrymen to the very last straw." The year's end saw the death of a major figure in Roger, Bishop of Salisbury. William of Malmesbury notes that, quote, "Fortune, which had favoured him greatly for so long, finally stung him cruelly with a scorpion's tail." A potential powerful opponent perished, but Stephen still faced another thorn in his side in Nigel, Bishop of Ely, whose castles had been confiscated the previous year. Stephen may have hoped to confine serious opposition to the west by allowing Matilda's ride there, but by 1140 this hope was exposed as forlorn. The West Country would remain a bastion of Angevin control throughout the war. Far north the King of Scots was defeated, but was still brooding and in effective control. Now Nigel struck, hoping to absorb East Anglia into his orbit. Nigel had proved the most aggressive in his resistance to Stephen during the bishop's incident, only yielding because of Matilda of Ramsbury's love for her lover and son. With a tangible ally in the Angevins now present, Nigel must have assumed he had had a chance and made Ely his base. Made famous by the resistance of Hereward the Wake, Ely was at the time only approachable by boat, the marshy ground proving deadly to attackers. However, it seems King Stephen knew his history and mimicked the actions of his more illustrious grandfather, William the Conqueror, by forming a boat bridge which his men used to suddenly attack the isle. Much like Hereward before him though, Nigel slipped through Stephen's grasp, using the marshy land as cover, but with many of his own knights taken. However, he did make it to Gloucester. Nigel's hopes for creating a second Angevin front in the east were thus crushed. Back west, Herefordshire and Gloucestershire suffered under the shadow of Miles of Gloucester following his victory at Wallingford, the castle of Winchcombe falling to him on 31st January 1140. Meanwhile, Angevin territory creeped west into Cornwall when William Fitz-Richard, who held much territory for the king, defected. He formed a pact with Reginald Fitzroy, another of Henry I's bastards, who would prove just as stalwart in his devotion to Matilda as Robert. Reginald married William's daughter and thus gained access to the latter's castles. Stephen, energetic as ever, marched west with an army to contest this loss, regaining most of the strongholds lost with the exception of the one that Reginald occupied, and even installed his own man, Alan the Black, as Earl of Cornwall in opposition to Reginald. Reginald was the Angevin appointee for Cornwall and would prove the de facto Earl, driving out Stephen's man to claim the county for the Empress. Despite the widespread outbreak of fighting, a peace conference was organised in Bath by Henry of Blois. Robert, who had recaptured much of the territory taken by Stephen earlier last year, attended to represent his half-sister, with the king represented by his wife, Queen Matilda, and Theobald of Bec. Despite this promising start though, talks never really got going, given Stephen rejected the notion that the church would dictate the settlement. Given Stephen's recent dealings with the bishops and the dubious loyalty of his brother, there was little wonder of this. Bath proved an Angevin target, being one of the few places in the west still under royal control. The fighting was likely a Blessevin ambush, led by royalist knights Roger and John, and saw Geoffrey Talbot, the man who had previously tried to take the town, mortally wounded. Talbot breathed his last on August 22nd, perhaps to Stephen's delight, capping off what would have been a royalist victory. In September of 1140, the Angevins brutally assaulted Nottingham, which like Worcester was sacked and burnt to the ground and reduced to ashes. Worcester and Nottingham are notable in their destruction and give a good bead on the power levels of the two factions at this stage of the war. The sack of Worcester and Nottingham were calculated to undermine Stephen's authority, but were also obviously desperate acts and not conducive to a longer term and stable Angevin regime. The west was Angevin heartland by the close of 1140, but it was constricted, and outside of a crushing and decisive battle, the Angevins could only hope to open up another front in the east to undermine Stephen's rule, or else hope for Geoffrey's success in Normandy and that he would lend aid in England. For Stephen, he still had the upper hand, both militarily and politically, commanding the loyalty of the majority of the nobility and land. He was the crowned, anointed and accepted monarch. His military aims were to subdue the smaller fortifications around the major strongholds of Bristol, Gloucester, with the ultimate aim of taking them. Yet despite these aims, fate would prove a fickle mistress for both sides, as the crucial year of 1141 dawned. After around 2 years of fighting, the so-called Anarchy conflict, more aptly characterised as the Norman succession crisis of mid-12th century England, reached its most eventful year. 1141 was a year of triumphs and firsts, of glories and rejection, but most of all its events set in motion the trend towards stalemate that would ravage the Kingdom of England for years after. The year initially saw the unlikely rise of the Empress Matilda, which oddly enough began with a social call by two noble ladies to the wife of the Castellan of Lincoln Castle. To flesh out the background of the Battle of Lincoln, we must focus on the character of Ranulph de Garnon, the Earl of Chester. He was married to yet another Matilda, the elder daughter of Robert of Gloucester, who, as we know, was the Empress Matilda's chief military commander. Ranulph disputed ownership over some northern territories given by his father to Stephen's predecessor, King Henry I, in return for his recognition as Earl of Chester. However, now he was Earl, and Henry was safely dead. Ranulph wanted both his lands and his rights returned. Unfortunately for Ranulph and King Stephen, given subsequent events, these lands were given over to David, King of Scots, as part of the agreement following his invasion of 1136, which did give him effective control of the north. Throw into this complex mix of families the fact that Ranulph was also the half-brother of a certain William de Rumere, who held lands in both Lincolnshire and Normandy. William too felt greatly aggrieved that Stephen, having created the earldom of Lincolnshire in 1139, hadn't appointed him as the Earl, but instead gave the honour to another William, the husband of King Henry's widow, Adeliza, who we remember as the Lord of Arundel Castle, which was the landing point of the Empress Matilda in 1139. So with these two grouchy barons on the sidelines, their wives just happened to be visiting their friend, the wife of the Castellan of Lincoln Castle, in late 1140. Naturally, as any good husband would, Ranulph had rode to Lincoln to collect his wife, and requested the garrison allow him entry. Since he was accompanied by just 3 knights, and had the excuse of collecting his wife Matilda and her companion Hoise, this was granted. With hindsight, or perhaps to the more paranoid of contemporaries, this visit could have looked downright suspicious, given Hoise was not just de Rumere's wife, but also the sister of the hot-headed pro-Angevin supporter, Baldwin de Redvers. This familial fact, which, along with her companion Matilda, who was a daughter of Robert of Gloucester and wife of the disgruntled Ranulph, should have caused at least some concern to the wary men at Lincoln that day. Ranulph, though, gained entry and quickly overcame the guards. He then forced open the gates to allow William de Rumere's men, who had been hiding in wait nearby, to take the castle. With custody of the castle quickly came control of the town, yet though they physically held Lincoln, the townsfolk were largely hostile. The citizens were actually largely supportive of King Stephen and immediately sent for his aid. Stephen responded with characteristic speed, mustering a force and moving towards Lincoln. He reached the city before the end of Christmas of 1140 and was enthusiastically let into the town by the citizens, quickly surrounding the castle too. However, before the Blessevins tightened the noose, Ranulph managed to slip away, leaving his wife as well as William and Hoise to face the siege. Riding hard for Cheshire to muster reinforcements, he also sent a message to his father-in-law, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, informing him that his daughter was now trapped behind Lincoln's castle walls. In addition, Ranulph offered to swear fealty to the Empress Matilda in return for aid in relieving the siege, perhaps with little choice anyway, and in any case glad to recruit another major landholder to her cause. Matilda accepted his fealty, and therefore Robert and Miles of Gloucester mustered their own supporters, which included a number of other disinherited nobles, as well as large numbers of Welshmen, and eventually they headed to Lincoln. For her part, the Empress, in whose name the anti-Stephen army fought, could only remain rooted in Gloucester, awaiting news of developments with trepidation. Robert's coalition, jointly led with Ranulph and Miles, arrived south of the city on February 1st, 1141. Before went the bridge, probably because it was either too narrow, or perhaps because it had been destroyed by the city folk, approaching from the west. February 2nd was not King Stephen's best day. The night before battle was terrible. A storm raged, with hail, thunder and lightning. The king attended Mass in Lincoln Cathedral the next day, and, according to the Deeds of Stephen, the candle he held as part of the service snapped in his hands, its flame extinguished. To the medieval mind, these events could be nothing other than an evil omen, a harbinger of hard times to come. Stephen had a small force with him, mustered rapidly and intended for a siege of Lincoln Castle. Earl Robert, the probable de facto commander of the Angevin force, had more men, a fact not lost on either side. Robert and his allies were not therefore afraid to face Stephen openly, though battles were actually quite rare, given the great risk that came with them. Stephen's scouts and advisors urged the king to withdraw and rethink. However, the king met their concerns with a steely, if misplaced, resolution. It's possible that memories of the ridicule suffered by his father heavily influenced his conduct that day. Stephen's father, Count Stephen of Blois, was one of the leaders of the First Crusade, though in 1098 he had fled the battlefield at the siege of Antioch, and therefore very publicly failed to fulfill his crusading vow to take Jerusalem. Though he died in battle in 1102 on another crusading mission, the stain on him and the family was never really extinguished. The jester Stephani seemingly confirms this, stating, quote, "Stephen refused to sully his fame by the disgrace of flight, but went boldly to meet them outside the town." Alderic Vitalis too writes that, quote, "The wilful prince turned a deaf ear to the advice of prudent men, and judged it dishonourable to put off battle for any reason." Perhaps Stephen couldn't stand the thought of the likely taunts that would come if he similarly withdrew that day. The pro-Blessavin citizens of Lincoln had also pledged to bolster his army. The temptation of having all his chief enemies in one place may also have played its part. The Angevin host was led by Ranulph, Robert and Miles of Gloucester. To capture and kill these men would certainly deflate Angevin chances beyond hope. An interesting contrast is highlighted in the sources between Stephen and Robert. While King Stephen delegates the task of the pre-battle speech to Baldwin Fitzgilbert, whose brother had actually been killed in the early fighting in Wales. This was done due to Stephen's poor rhetorical skills, and is actually depicted in the Chronicle of Henry of Huntingdon by line drawing in pen and ink. Baldwin ascended a nearby hill to make his speech, insulting the enemy leaders by shouting that Robert had the heart of a hare. He therefore reminded the royalists of the justice of their cause, fighting rebels against their lawful king, as well as emphasising their courage and numbers. The Angevin host had more enthusiastic speakers. Ranulph spoke first, before Robert riles up his men by reminding them that he was old King Henry's son, and that he fought for his sister's right to the throne. They fight against perjurers who broke their oath to Matilda, and to gain back their lands from a king who poorly governs and disinherits men of their rights and property. Robert too hurled insults back at the enemy leaders, that Earl Alan was guilty of every evil, that Waleron was boastful, as well as slow to advance, while quick to retreat, that Earl Hugh Bigard was a perjurer, and, perhaps most stinging, that William of Aumale, the Earl of York, had been deserted by his wife because of his own filthy behaviour, and that he shamefully stood beside his wife's lover. William of Ypres was branded impure and treasonous. Having concluded this round of insults, the Earl of Gloucester then finished to a great shout of his army. The two forces were roughly arrayed in similar formations of 3 battles. Robert and his cavalry formed the vanguard in the centre, with Ranulph on the right, with a mixture of Welsh and horse. The left contingent was also composed of Welshmen under the command of Miles, as well as the brothers Maredudd and Cadwaladr. Facing them was the mercenary cavalry of William of Ypres, largely made up of Flemish and Breton men. Stephen himself had dismounted and commanded the centre, composed of a solid formation of spears, interspersed with knights, while to his right was a similar group of earls. The royal army then fielded around 1,000 men, in contrast to Robert's 1,500 or so. Robert targeted the king with a charge against Stephen's battle in the centre. However, the Welsh allies were destroyed almost immediately by William of Ypres and Alan Earl of Richmond, who had targeted them, mostly massed on Robert's left. Despite this initial success in driving away the Welsh, William's mercenaries were quickly countercharged by Ranulph's more reliable knights, with accounts suggesting that the enemy fled before battle proper was joined. Whatever the case, William of Ypres' retreat was the decisive moment. Perhaps he saw the ferocity of Robert's attack, and that Stephen was hard-pressed to the point of hopelessness. It was more likely that William of Ypres, a seasoned military commander, could already see the battle was lost, and elected to fight another day, given he was less likely to receive lenient treatment if taken. To King Stephen's credit, this was perhaps both a moment of failure, but also of personal pride, given he fought on bravely, even ferociously, despite the disintegration of his army. The earls too had fled their king, yet he fought on, breaking his trusty sword, and then a Norwegian battle axe, handed to him as described by Aldrich Vitalis, both with overuse. Stephen was finally felled, ingloriously with a stone, that struck him on the helmet, stunning him long enough for a certain William of Cahagnes to lay hands on him, shouting triumphantly, "Here, everybody, here, I have the king!" With Stephen's capture, the battle was over. According to William of Malmesbury, Robert treated Stephen well, with strict instructions to preserve him, not even allowing his captors to insult or otherwise harm him. Such leniency could not be extended to the citizens of Lincoln. Around 500 drowned in the nearby river as they scrambled into 3 boats that quickly capsized with the weight, meeting watery ends, and Lincoln itself was torched by the Angevins. February 2nd of 1141 was thus a day that would be forever scarred into the mind of Stephen, King of England, given it was the day he almost lost grip on power forever. As a woman, Matilda could not don armour, take up the sword directly to wrest her crown from her rival, and so waited for news at Gloucester Castle while events played out. She was some 140 miles away from Lincoln, so news would probably have filtered through to her by the 6th or 7th of February, and this would have been closely followed by Earl Robert himself, and with him, the usurper. Unfortunately, there's no specific account of what words were exchanged between the royal cousins. However, it's likely Matilda treated Stephen with the respect afforded to his station, at least at first. Stephen was, after all, a king, and though a usurper, was still anointed by God, despite her superior claim. Stephen was moved south to Robert's stronghold of Bristol, perhaps haunted by popular memories of his uncle Robert Curthos's lifelong imprisonment. But if Stephen had ideas of a luxurious confinement, or even escape, then his hopes were dashed as his confinement became decidedly harsher. Robert had him bound in chains. According to William of Malmesbury, who we really must be cautious with given his bias towards Robert, Stephen's confinement became harsher given he had been found a few times wandering outside his quarters at night, though we can't avoid the obvious suspicion that this harsher condition may also have been due to spite. With this sudden reversal in fortunes, many magnates readjusted their allegiances. A few fought on, including Alan, Earl of Richmond, who attempted to ambush the victorious Ranulph. However, it was Alan who was taken. He was chained, tortured mercilessly in a dungeon till he submitted, swearing homage to Ranulph and handing over his castles. Hervey, Earl of Wiltshire, also held out in Devizes Castle. He was firmly ensconced in the Blessevin camp, given his marriage to Stephen's daughter. He was besieged in Devizes and eventually forced to surrender, being banished abroad. 2 prominent men who quickly adjusted to the change in political reality were Henry of Blois, the king's own brother, and the castellan of the Tower, Geoffrey de Mandeville. Waleron de Beaumont came to terms with the Angevins in September. Similarly, in Normandy, men began to jump over. Indeed, Waleron submitted in England, as much due to his peace with Geoffrey in Normandy. The Bishop of Lisieux, who had been a leading figure in Stephen's administration there, also came to peace with Geoffrey. In England, the main obstacle to Matilda's coronation was the Church. Pope Innocent had recognised Stephen as king, and a coronation was a religious ceremony that could not just be undone at a stroke. The Empress's own coronation would go a long way to establishing her own legitimacy in this regard, but support of the leading churchmen was still vital. To this end, Matilda and Robert pressured her rival monarch's brother, Henry of Blois, to recognise her openly. Henry's loyalties had been surprisingly loose, as we have seen. He had escorted Matilda as part of her safe conduct granted by Stephen to Bristol from Arundel, probably having arranged the deal in the first place. The antagonism with Stephen may have stretched back further to Theobald of Becke's appointment to the See of Canterbury over him, though Henry had played his part in persuading the Church to initially accept Stephen as king. Henry, though, seemingly needed little persuasion of the political reality of Lincoln. As it turned out, Henry had a fairly strong hand. He was a senior bishop and, as papal legate, was the highest ranking churchman in the land, even above Theobald of Becke. In addition, he was also Bishop of Winchester, the home of the royal treasury. Henry agreed to swear fealty to Matilda and hand over the treasury, though in return she promised to consult him on all matters and give all appointments to the bishoprics over to him. Now fully on board with the new regime, Henry completed the about-face by using his authority as a papal legate to summon a church council. However, such a change of loyalties was not so easy for some of these clerics, most prominent among them Henry's rival, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Theobald argued that he was bound by his oath of allegiance to Stephen. Matilda had arrived in Winchester on March 3rd and sealed this settlement with great ceremony. Henry had the treasury handed over to her, the clerk Thurston, even giving Matilda the royal crown. Henry then arranged for the people of the city to gather in the marketplace to officially salute the Empress as their lady and queen. Following this, she entered the cathedral in procession, with the Bishop of Winchester on her right and the Bishop of St. David's on her left. At least one important city, then, had accepted Matilda as queen, yet Theobald's reluctance was a major problem, though one that Matilda was sympathetic to. Matilda did allow Theobald and other reluctant clergymen to meet with Stephen himself, who surprisingly released them from their allegiance. Meanwhile, next on the agenda for Henry of Blois was to cement this political change with a speech. He emphasised the state of war that had held for some 5 years, the oaths that had been sworn to Matilda during her father's reign, and finally Stephen's loss at Lincoln. He finished by declaring his new monarch, or Lady of the English. This is an interesting use of phrase, given she obviously could not have had herself declared king, but neither would she feel comfortable with queen, given that it may send out the wrong connotations, given she would arguably share the title, and her own name for that matter, with King Stephen's consort. It's also important to stress the actual fragility of her position despite her force's triumph at Lincoln. Her situation was unique. No woman had actually ruled in her own right, in England or Normandy, though female rule was relatively common at committal level. Perhaps to strengthen her position, this new title was still third in precedence behind her styles Empress and daughter of King Henry. But even as Henry apparently made the final political arrangements, ending his brother's reign for good, perhaps the most prominent of Stephen's supporters remained very much at large and active in the southeast. Queen Matilda herself had sent messages to Matilda imploring her to release her husband and restore him to the throne, or at least allow him to join a monastery. This may seem forlorn, but Stephen's queen was actually more secure than the Empress Matilda would have liked, with a strong base in Kent, along with the support of William of Ypres, who had wisely withdrawn from Lincoln. By mid-June, the Empress Matilda's momentum appeared unstoppable. She had the church on the side, more and more barons submitted to her, and at Westminster, Geoffrey de Mandeville, Castellan of the Tower, did so too. This was the climax of what had become somewhat of a triumphal procession. The Empress welcomed at Wilton beforehand by Theobald of Becke, before moving on to Reading, where Robert de Olie surrendered his castle in Oxford, and at St Albans people acclaimed her once more, with citizens from London approaching to arrange for a welcome there. As if to further emphasise the new reality of her rule, her first act in London was to appoint a new Bishop of London to the long vacant see. According to Henry of Huntingdon, quote, "The whole of the people of England accepted the Empress as their ruler, with the exception of the men of Kent, where the Queen and William of Ypres resisted her to the utmost of their power." In the end, the Empress Matilda's brief stint in London proved the height of her power in relation to becoming Queen of England. Yet it was not only her rival Queen in Kent who alone undone her ambitions, but the Empress herself, specifically in her conduct in London. Ironically too, given Stephen had alienated him, Matilda's loss of Bishop Henry's support also proved decisive. Henry had threw his support behind her on the premise that he would be afforded real power at court. Taking her at her word, he moved to have Stephen's remaining estates of Boulogne and Mortain as well as lands in Essex and Kent, transferred to Eustace, the dethroned king's eldest son and Henry's nephew. Matilda, though, rejected the proposal, perhaps not keen to create another Blessington nexus of discontent in her kingdom. The result, though, was disastrous. Henry had been humiliated at court, and even temporarily left for a few days. The chroniclers at this point simply set upon her. The Deeds of Stephen is the most vitriolic, stating that after entering the capital, she arrogantly demanded a tax, quote, "not with unassuming gentleness, but with a voice of authority." When the Londoners refused, arguing that they had spent all their money supporting King Stephen against her, quote, "she, with a grim look, her forehead wrinkled into a frown, every trace of a woman's gentleness removed from her face, blazed into unbearable fury." So did Matilda's own character betray her on the cusp of her elevation to queenship? It's certainly known that the Empress's character was formed largely by her formative years and education in the Holy Roman Empire. There, as a young woman, she had been treated with the deference of an empress. She had even ruled briefly northern Italy as a regent for her husband Henry V. It's likely then that this haughtiness, as it's often described, was in fact appropriate to her experience and education in Germany, but wholly unhelpful in England. Meanwhile, the Bishop Henry absented himself from Matilda's court for several days, as we have seen, and in that same time he met secretly with his sister-in-law Matilda of Blois at Guildford. In addition to alienating Henry and many other prominent men, the Empress may also have further eroded her support from the Church by confirming the candidate for the See of Durham of David, King of Scots, who was present with her at the time. The consensus of resistance was bubbling to the boil. As if her husband's defeat and dethronement were not enough, Queen Matilda had had her diplomatic feelers to the Empress met with simple disdain, her envoys at the Winchester Council abused and insulted when they suggested that Stephen be released to enter a monastery, and Eustace, his and Queen Matilda's son's inheritance be respected. With no avenue for peace through diplomacy, Queen Matilda, with William of Ypres, marched on London with effectively nothing to lose. Meanwhile, angered at the Londoners' reluctance to pay the tax, but most likely sufficiently assured of her coronation, the Empress sat down to dinner on 24th of June 1141. However, as she did so, bells began to pierce the early evening air, and angry Londoners, having flung open the gates of the capital, began attacking Matilda's followers. It would soon become apparent that the city folk were in league with the defeated Stephen's queen, with the burgesses taking her part. Taken completely by surprise, with her followers scattered, the Empress had no choice but to mount her horse and flee, along with her closest advisors. Very soon afterwards, the mob smashed into her apartments, plundering all they could, the Empress's dinner still warm. Matilda, Robert of Gloucester, and David, King of Scots, all fled to Oxford, while Henry of Blois headed to Winchester. For Matilda, this must have been a gut-wrenching, humiliating climb down, forced to flee from her capital on the cusp of her coronation. So it was that Matilda of Blois, Queen Consort of England, reignited the Blessington cause and was likely welcomed with much more warmth than her namesake had been. Early converts back to the Blessington camp included Henry of Blois and Geoffrey de Mandeville, Castellan of the Tower of London. In Oxford, the Angevins regrouped and quickly realised that to recoup things they needed to regain the initiative. The Empress's position had rapidly collapsed, she having lost the support of key leading figures, arguably the Church, as well as London and now the city of Winchester too. The turnaround in fortunes was almost full circle. Fortune's wheel was now swiftly turning back to Stephen's favour, as not only did his queen restore Blessington control over the capital, the Castellan of the Tower reverting to his allegiance, but she also reclaimed the loyalty of her slippery brother-in-law, Henry of Blois. She did this, according to the Deeds of Stephen, moving him, quote, by the woman's tearful supplications, which she pressed on him with great earnestness. Thus, in another crazy political about-face, the man who had only 2 months prior declared the Empress Matilda Lady of the English, and urged everyone else to, now re-declared for his brother Stephen, and ordered all of England's magnates to do so. So, in the space of just a few days, Matilda, daughter of King Henry, had sunk from the point of her imminent coronation to inglorious flight. In Oxford, she gathered herself. An attack on London was inadvisable, now both the city and the Tower were back within Queen Matilda's control. But Winchester was a different matter. Henry of Blois had fled there in the opposite direction to his lady, and had now shamelessly betrayed her. More importantly was the fact that the city held the royal treasury and had symbolic importance. With all this in mind, the Angevin forces gathered once more and headed south to Winchester. Winchester actually housed two castles, one royal one in the west of the city, which was still held by men of Matilda, and a second situated in the southeast, which was the Bishop Henry's personal residence. Queen Matilda arrived in the first on 31st of July. Henry, however, was already long gone. He had fled to Queen Matilda's camp at Guildford, setting up his own castle of Wolvesey against the Empress. Unlike at Lincoln, Matilda was very close to the action in the second royal castle, though she was obviously in no immediate danger. Robert of Gloucester set his base of operations in the centre of the city before commencing the siege of Wolvesey on August 1st. However, any hopes of another glorious triumph were quickly dashed as flames spread through the city. Before his hasty departure, the Bishop Henry of Blois had instructed his men in Wolvesey Castle to set the surroundings ablaze. This was particularly odd, or perhaps a mark of Henry's ruthlessness, given he was willing to sacrifice the lives and well-being of his flock to deprive Matilda and her army of shelter and provisions. To compound matters, Queen Matilda and her army approached in August, perhaps accompanied by the duplicitous Henry, surrounded the city. Now the Empress was in turn trapped, caught between two hostile forces, the one within Wolvesey Castle and the other now encircling them within a charred and closed urban environment. Food was scarce, with Queen Matilda having cut off the Empress's supply lines from the northwest and west of the city, which led to her West Country territory. Conversely, the Queen's army was well supplied from the east, with her forces even supplemented by a force of London militia. In an attempt to weaken the siege, Robert of Gloucester sent John Marshall with a force to fortify Wherwell Abbey. However, the men inside were themselves trapped and burned out by the men William of Ypres. Having thrown torches into the building, knights, men and nuns all staggered out. However, John Marshall remained inside, the roof of the structure collapsing in on him, and he's being horrifically blinded by molten lead dripping onto his face. Amazingly though, he survived. News of the defeat at Wherwell was probably broadcast to Matilda's troops within the city in an attempt to further undermine their morale. With this final hope extinguished, a tense stalemate ensued, which could only realistically be broken by starvation, surrender, or some kind of breakout. On Sunday 14th of September, the Angevins elected for the third option, and the army began to withdraw in good order. Luckily, the Empress Matilda was placed at the head of the close column, accompanied by Brian Fitzcount and the Earl of Cornwall. Earl Robert took up his position in the rearguard, the area most likely to come under attack. Unfortunately, the orderly retreat soon broke down into a chaotic rout, with panicked and sporadic fighting for about 8 miles. Queen Matilda's army mercilessly closed in on all sides, with the Empress Matilda only narrowly escaping to John Marshall's castle at Ludgershall, some 20 miles away. From there she rode hard to Devizes, and thence onto the safety of Gloucester, which she reached in a litter, having long since succumbed to exhaustion. Meanwhile, back with the main army, David, King of Scots, was captured no fewer than 3 times, but bribed his way to freedom each time, and eventually escaped to his own lands. Miles of Gloucester too narrowly escaped, found his way to Gloucester, but having discarded most of his armour, and on foot. By far, however, the worst loss of the entire fiasco was Matilda's half-brother. Robert of Gloucester had led the efforts in the rear, and was thus in the thick of the fighting, when, at the congested ford of Stockbridge, he was completely surrounded by the men of William of Ypres and taken captive. Having rose to the captor of a king at Lincoln, now reduced to the prisoner of the Queen, Robert was transferred to Rochester Castle, deep within Blessington territory, where he had next to no hope of escape. For the Empress Matilda, her year of triumph had soured into the bitterest of defeats. Winchester was lost, along with its treasury, as was London. Her army was now broken, and her greatest supporter, confidant, and chief general was taken. The deeds of Stephen crows that, quote, "Such was the rout, so terrible and wonderful in the eyes of all that even the oldest man can hardly remember one like it in our age." The year of 1141 proved a year of stunning reversals for both sides of this medieval civil war. King Stephen, by the beginning of February, found himself in custody at Gloucester Castle following his defeat at the Battle of Lincoln. The Empress Matilda had been on the verge of claiming the throne, but had been driven from London. She had gambled on striking Winchester, the important south-central city, which had initially supported her, but was now of questionable loyalty, given that the Bishop Henry had publicly switched allegiance back to Stephen. Like Stephen at Lincoln, Matilda and her commanders gambled at Winchester, but were smashed by the army of Queen Matilda and William of Ypres. The defeat was so complete that history remembers the events of 14th of September of 1141 as the Rout of Winchester. Yet though the rout was a huge reverse for the Empress's party, the broader balance of the war was largely that of stalemate. The Blessevins, like the Angevins, had lost their greatest commander in Stephen, and without Robert of Gloucester, the Empress's chances of regaining the upper hand were small indeed. The Royalists did have a decent commander in William of Ypres, though he could in no way fill the king's large boots as a political leader. William was effective Earl of Kent and had proved vital in the recent military efforts to turn things around, but he was unpopular as a Flemish-born bastard and leader of foreign troops. Stephen, who still languished in chains deep within Angevin territory, had arguably owed most thanks to his queen, Matilda of Blois, who had acted as the political opposition to seemingly insurmountable odds in early to mid-1141. On paper, the Empress Matilda still had viable leaders for her own battered forces in Miles of Gloucester and Brian Fitzcount, but no one as effective or prestigious as Robert. Robert's power stretched way beyond England's shores. Indeed, his lands in Normandy around Caen had provided the springboard for the Angevin push into England in the first place. Robert was a major player in Anglo-Norman politics and the greatest lord to back his half-sister's claim. He was also, after declaring openly for Matilda, a staunchly loyal advocate, having bravely led the rearguard during the rout near the ford of the River Test. He had enabled his sister to escape, but had been surrounded and taken by the men of the hated William of Ypres. Ironically, Robert had been vital in the capture of King Stephen himself at the Battle of Lincoln in February, holding his cousin in his own castle of Bristol. So if Robert had escaped the carnage of Winchester, even with the defeat panning out the same way otherwise, it's highly unlikely subsequent events would have proceeded as they did, and perhaps years of war may have been avoided if Stephen's leaderless party could have been brought to the negotiating table sooner than it eventually was. In the event, both sides found themselves deprived of their premier military leaders, and it became quite obvious to all that an exchange was the only way forward. At first, though, it seems that Queen Matilda did all she could to persuade Robert to switch sides. Confined in Rochester and deep within Blessevin territory, the Queen, according to John of Worcester, promised Robert that once her husband was restored, that he would be, quote, invested with the dominion of the whole of England under him, in an alliance of sorts between the two men. How likely such a deal would have lasted, given the obvious animosity between the two men, is an open question. Not very long is the likely answer. The loyal Robert rejected the deal, causing his captors to alter their approach. William of Malmesbury informs us that, following this rejection, Robert was threatened with transfer out of England completely, further into Stephen's sphere of influence in Blois, which Queen Matilda ruled in her own right. Much like the initial deal though, Robert likely surmised this was an empty threat, and extremely unlikely, given that his liege lady still held Stephen at Bristol. If Robert were removed to Boulogne, it's probable the Empress would have had Stephen transferred to Ireland, from where he would in all likelihood never return. Negotiations over a direct exchange were ongoing throughout the weeks after Winchester, with Robert's part naturally being taken by his wife Mabel, who, in his absence, was the actual custodian of King Stephen in Bristol. The Empress may have deliberated long over the business, but it was clear some exchange was crucial. With Stephen released, he would be restored to the throne, and back in London, and could definitely raise more forces against her. However, without Robert, she could keep her cousin away from the throne, but could get no nearer to it herself. The impasse was soon broken, but not before Robert, loyal as ever, played another hand in negotiations, trying to win the best outcome for himself and his lady sister. As an earl, he argued, he was not worthy of a direct one-to-one exchange with Stephen. Logically, the other prisoners taken at Winchester should also be released along with himself to make up the difference. Amazingly, and perhaps out of sheer love and political expedience, Queen Matilda actually considered this proposal, but whatever feelings she may have had on the matter were trumped by her own supporters. Gilbert Fitz-Richard de Clare had captured William of Salisbury during the rout, and the Queen's principal military commander, William of Ypres, had taken Humphrey de Bohun, with neither man willing to give up their rich ransoms. Despite his best efforts then, a direct exchange was made. In a medieval-style political musical chairs, Robert was moved closer to his own lands at Winchester, while Stephen, having been released from Bristol on November 1st, rode east, leaving as surety his wife, one of his own sons, and two unidentified magnates of high rank. Stephen made it to the site of his wife's stunning victory on November 3rd, at which point Robert was released. Robert in turn left behind his eldest son and heir William before riding to Bristol and perhaps into the arms of his waiting wife Mabel. Robert may have glimpsed or even exchanged a few terse words with the Queen on arrival, as she and her companions were duly released. The exchange was complete with the Queen and her party's arrival in Winchester, upon which William of Gloucester was set free. King Stephen himself, no doubt eternally grateful to his wife and supporters for all their efforts over the previous months, entered London to re-establish his authority. To really emphasise that he was back, and perhaps to rub salt into his cousin Matilda's wounds, Stephen was symbolically crowned for a second time in Canterbury by Archbishop Theobald on Christmas Day of 1141. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Angevin progress in Normandy was slow, sure, yet successful. The Empress's husband, Geoffrey, is often overlooked in more cursory examinations of the period, but he was in fact vital to the ultimate success of the Angevin faction in 1154, though at the time this may have seemed fanciful. Geoffrey had initially supported his wife's claim to his father-in-law's throne by pushing into Normandy and establishing her at Argentan, yet in 1139 Earl Robert had persuaded her to leave the continent and press her claims directly. Since this time, Geoffrey had made significant inroads into securing the whole of the duchy for his house. It should be noted that, unlike his wife, Geoffrey's ascent to control of Normandy was much smoother on a political level, with there being nothing unprecedented in a lord pressing his claims on a territory in right of his wife. That in contrast to a woman, the Empress, pressing her claim on sovereign power in England. Geoffrey's incursions into Normandy were small and slow. He had a foothold in the region, thanks to the castles earlier captured before Matilda's thrust north. He also enjoyed friendly relations with Robert, Earl of Gloucester's lands around the Caen region. The initial problem for Geoffrey was Stephen's control of the north of the duchy through his lieutenants, notably Waleron de Beaumont and William de Rumère. Furthermore, Stephen's alliance with King Louis also complicated matters, as did the threat of Geoffrey overextending himself. Anjou and Maine were not exempt from trouble themselves, with Geoffrey having to put down internal rebellions in 1135 and then throughout the 1140s, making offensive campaigns quite tricky. Elias, his younger brother, was a particularly prickly thorn in his side, and he was only conclusively dealt with later on, with Geoffrey imprisoning him till his death in 1151. Fortunately for Geoffrey, the political ramifications of Lincoln were not confined to England, with three notable magnates defecting to his camp following Stephen's capture and confinement. William de Rumère responded to Geoffrey's immediate demand of recognition in the affirmative, with the Count of Perche and John, Bishop of Lisieux, also coming over to his side. Lisieux was particularly damaging for Stephen's camp, given he headed the king's administration in Normandy. These defections, along with the support of Robert, Earl of Gloucester's lands, gave Geoffrey the edge. The only remaining and significant threat to Geoffrey's designs on Normandy was the king's elder brother, Theobald. Last we heard of Theobald was way back in 1135-6, during his younger brother's initial years as king. Many magnates assumed that if Matilda was to be overlooked, then the throne should be offered to the elder of Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror's sons. However, as was effectively the case then, the Count of both Blois and Champagne balked at actually fighting for this right. Orderic Vitalis qualifies this by writing that, quote, "He declined to burden himself with the weight of such vast cares, but ceded his right to Geoffrey." That the deferment was conditional on Theobald receiving Tours and for his brother to be released was neither here nor there. The principle had been established. With no practical political alternative, it's no wonder that most Norman barons accepted Geoffrey and Matilda's overlordship, at least as a necessary evil, if not an outright political reality. Geoffrey's momentum was thus irresistible, while his wife's campaign in England bogged down into stalemate, with her only controlling the southwest and losing London and Winchester in 1141. Geoffrey slowly progressed north and west, capturing castles as he went. The dramatic turn of fortune's wheel in England did little to hamper his progress. By the end of 1142, the Count of Anjou controlled all of western Normandy, and was thus looking towards the subjugation of Rouen itself. Around this time, perhaps Geoffrey's greatest single legacy to the world was emerging as a key political player in his own right. Henry Fitz-Empress, the eldest son and heir of both Geoffrey and Matilda, was around 9 years old around the spring of 1142. A reality that further solidified Geoffrey's position and resolve, given he could now slowly switch his political banner from fighting by right of his wife to that of fighting for his son, as the true male heir of both England and Normandy, a position much more appealing to the wider Anglo-Norman world. Back in England, the two sides spent the initial months of 1142 consolidating their positions. Matilda, according to the deeds of Stephen, had been greatly shaken and exhausted by the rout of Winchester. Demoralised and perhaps seeking consolation to a dramatic loss in London the previous year, she based herself at Oxford, which was much closer to London than Gloucester was. Stephen was ill throughout the early part of 1142, likely an effect of his harsh confinement. Yet despite this, the Angevins could not force victory given their own substantial recent losses. At a council around Lent in Devizes, Matilda and her advisors decided they would need to send for help from Geoffrey. On paper, this may seem a simple task, with the messenger sent and her husband more than willing to provide aid to his wife. Yet, in truth, their union was wholly based on political convenience, with a shared interest in the future of their sons, particularly Henry. Geoffrey knew he would never rule England in his own right, and was far more interested in securing Normandy for his son. What's more, relations were such that Geoffrey would not even countenance sending aid or coming himself without consulting Robert of Gloucester himself. To Robert, this would normally have been an unconscionably stupid move, with Stephen on the loose once more. But as it so happened, Stephen's illness was sufficiently dire to remove any immediate threat to his sister, and so Robert acquiesced, heading across the Channel, heading for Caen, where he sent to Geoffrey for a meeting. The meeting didn't go well for Robert, Geoffrey arguing that he could not consider leaving the region or providing substantial aid without first subduing various castles in Normandy. Robert reluctantly tagged along, the duo subduing 10 or so strongholds. In the event, though, Robert was turned down. Geoffrey did suggest sending his son with Robert, hoping that on seeing him the nobles might be inspired to fight for the cause of the lawful heir. The answer now became clear. Geoffrey's priorities were firmly rooted in Normandy. This may with hindsight seem short-sighted or even callous to us today, yet it was actually a prudent move. Matilda and her party had had the crown in their hands in mid-1141 and had somehow squandered the chance. Geoffrey, by contrast, had made real gains in Normandy, a region on his doorstep, already controlling Anjou and Maine. To add Normandy to the mix would go much further to strengthening the Angevin cause overall than any half-hearted attempts at regaining the upper hand in England. Of course, this is just conjecture on my part. Applying our crystal-clear hindsight again, Robert's sojourn to Normandy almost proved calamitous to his sister's cause. As it turned out, Stephen wasn't that ill and had miraculously recovered at Northampton, though rumour had been he was at death's door. The lull in the war was very much over. Stephen took Cirencester by stealth, much of its garrison being absent, reducing the place and its rampart to ashes. He then took Bampton and Radcott, before riding hard to Wareham and taking the castle from the ineffectual William of Gloucester, and more importantly, cutting off Robert's access back to England. Having cut off Matilda from her chief military commander, the king now set about isolating her in Oxford. He had smartly set about reducing any fortification in the vicinity by taking the aforementioned castles to eliminate any chance of relief or resupply. With aid from Robert or nearby castles cut off, Stephen turned his full attention to Oxford, which he reached on 26th of September. Unlike in 1139 at Arundel, Stephen had no intention of allowing a peaceful ride to Angevin territory. His objective was simple: capture Matilda. If the Empress could be taken, this would effectively end the war by removing the Angevin political leader. This, of course, was easier said than done, with Matilda already known for her incredible luck on this score, having escaped Stephen's clutches at Arundel in 1139, then barely escaping the London mob, before once again shaking off capture during the rout of Winchester. Stephen, though, was determined this time to gain possession of the Empress. The Deeds of Stephen gives a decent description of what Stephen faced to achieve this. Quote, "Now Oxford is a city very securely protected, inaccessible because of the very deep water that washes it all around, most carefully encircled by a palisade of an outwork on one side, and on another finely and very strongly fortified by an impregnable castle and tower of great height." Given this apparent security, the Angevins within took to taunting the king's men, shooting arrows from the walls. Stephen grimly led his men across the river by ford, the water deep enough to require them to swim. Yet Stephen himself took the lead, driving the defenders from the gates in a fierce charge. Stephen's host then burst into the city, setting it alight before blockading the castle. Black memories of Winchester likely flooded the Empress's mind. Now she was truly trapped, this time with no heroic champion to hold back her foes as she made a dash for safety. Matilda now knew her salvation could only come through relief, and there were seemingly no feasible takers. David I was back in Scotland following the rout at Winchester. Miles of Gloucester simply didn't have enough men to challenge the king, and Brian Fitzcount was close by at Wallingford, but was himself pinned in place, lest he lose his own castle. Matilda could thus only watch with trepidation as Stephen established his blockade by posting guards all around the castle and brought up his siege engines. Meanwhile, Robert was on the move, having accepted Geoffrey's suggestion by taking the young Henry Fitz-Empress back with him. With them went 300 knights and 52 ships, which actually implies that Geoffrey had not completely refused aid. Unlike his crossing over, which had been dangerously stormy, Robert's voyage back was much calmer. He considered a landing at Southampton, but instead elected to attack Wareham despite its loss earlier on. Stephen's grip on the place proved weaker than perhaps he had hoped. Robert quickly took over the landing space, then the town, before menacingly moving his own throwing engines forward. The threat was enough to induce an accord. The garrison would surrender if no aid was forthcoming from the king. Robert probably hoped that his presence there and the siege itself would tempt the king south, allowing his sister a reprieve. But Stephen was not moved to action. It took 3 weeks for the surrender at Wareham, by which time the situation in Oxford was worsening. Like Miles of Gloucester, he also had a smaller force, which was unlikely to prove victorious in a Lincoln-like confrontation at Oxford. Nevertheless, Robert did take the initiative, not attacking Stephen at Oxford, but taking the castle on the island of Portland and then Lulworth, before calling a council of war at Cirencester. It was here that a consensus formed to relieve the Empress regardless, despite the disadvantage in numbers. However, if Robert despaired at the Angevins' chances, he was soon amazed at some welcome news. His sister had taken matters into her own hands and had escaped the trap. The Empress likely understood perfectly well that Stephen's objective was not Oxford Castle, but her. Oxford suffered because Stephen wanted the Empress under lock and key, and she had been besieged since September with no idea if relief would ever materialise, so devised an audacious plan of escape. It was just before Christmas 1142, and the landscape was frozen and snow-covered, which suited her intent perfectly. In the early hours of a deathly cold December morning, the Empress quietly slipped out of the castle's small postern door outside of the city, accompanied by just 3 devoted knights. More fanciful accounts have her being lowered by ropes down the walls, but this seems unlikely given the easier and much safer option aforementioned. Henry of Huntington relates that Matilda and her companions were all garbed in white garments that camouflaged them in the frozen night. The Deeds of Stephen completes the dramatic scene, having Matilda and her knights tiptoe, quote, through the king's pickets, which everywhere were breaking the silence of the night, with the blaring of trumpeters or the cries of men shouting loudly. Somehow, once past the camp, the party made it to Abingdon and procured some horses before riding to Wallingford and then on to Devizes and ultimate safety. The king soon learned the truth, that Matilda had escaped once again, yet even the normally hostile deeds of Stephen praises the action. Quote, "In a wondrous fashion she escaped unharmed through so many enemies, so many watchers in the silence of the night. I do not know whether it was to heighten the greatness of her fame in time to come, or by God's judgment to increase more vehemently the disturbance of the kingdom. But never have I read of another woman so luckily rescued from so many mortal foes, and from the threat of dangers so great." The escape was certainly a gamble and a small triumph, yet the garrison the Empress left behind did not hold out for long afterwards, and Oxford too was taken back into Blessed hands by the end of the year. Overall, it's more accurate to state this whole dramatic event as an Angevin avoidance of a strategic defeat, the loss of Matilda, which would have effectively ended the war, rather than cast it as a victory. Stephen attempted to wrest back Wareham from Robert, but the latter had been strengthening its defences. It's around this time, though the exact chronology of events is quite confused, that Stephen and the Blessed forces concentrated around Wilton. Wilton was to be to the Royalists what Wallingford was to the Angevins, a frontier stronghold from which they could potentially project into enemy heartlands. Although the Empress had slipped through his grasp at the siege of Oxford, if Stephen could erode her strongholds in the West Country, it would go a very long way to neutering Matilda's bid for the throne, with or without her person at large. Initially after Oxford, as we have noted, Stephen now sought to repeat his earlier success by retaking Wareham, but upon arriving there, determined that it was too heavily defended to take. Instead he headed some 37 miles back north, having decided to take Salisbury. Salisbury was also just 25 short miles from Devizes, another important Angevin site. En route, he linked up with his duplicitous brother Henry, the Bishop of Winchester, before encamping at the town of Wilton, inside the abbey. However, Robert of Gloucester, perhaps still smarting from his recent error, leaving his sister to be besieged in Oxford, had no intention of fighting on the defensive. On 1st of July, as the light of the day died, Robert swept in and encircled Stephen's host within the area, thus trapping the king, his brother, and some of his nobles. Desperate to avoid the same fate as at Lincoln, where, isolated in the field with his own battle, Stephen had been captured, spent the better part of the year in chains, Stephen attempted a breakout. However, much like at Lincoln, Robert employed a cavalry charge to push back and disperse Stephen's men. For Stephen and Robert, the stakes were high. If Robert could seize the king once again, he could undo the damage caused by his own capture at Winchester. If Stephen could be recaptured here, the advantage would decisively swing back to the Angevins. By replicating the circumstances of early 1141, they may have a much easier time establishing their control, given the young Henry was now present, could be used as a political rallying point, deflecting concerns from a kingdom ruled by the haughty Matilda. But as Robert possibly pondered over the possibilities, it was Stephen's turn to give his enemies the slip. The king and his brother fled ignominiously to the darkness as Wilton's abbey burned. The many left behind were either killed or captured. One prominent prize for Robert was the castellan of Sherborne Castle, William Martel. Martel had been a dependable supporter of Stephen throughout the war, and was a former steward of King Henry I himself. It was Martel who fought a delaying rearguard skirmish to allow his king to escape. Like Robert at Winchester though, he was surrounded and taken. Thus ended the Battle of Wilton, though it may have been more appropriate to term it a skirmish. If the Empress still clung to hopes of succeeding to her father's throne herself, then Wilton arguably was the last best chance. Meanwhile, Stephen, perhaps haunted by guilt at having fled, and with the echoes of taunts about his own father's cowardice in abandoning the crusade years before, was more than willing to negotiate the release of his brave brother-in-arms. Sherborne Castle was given up to Robert as ransom for Martel. No small gesture, given the stronghold's strategic importance, it once being considered the master key of the whole kingdom. This loss effectively ended Stephen's campaign to disentangle Matilda's hold on the West Country. Wilton had proved a bone-chilling close call for the Blessevins, but trouble was brewing elsewhere, with 1143 being dominated by the rebellion of another key figure in Geoffrey de Mandeville. Geoffrey, like most magnates, had dutifully acknowledged the apparently victorious Empress after Lincoln, and in return he was confirmed Castellan, the Tower of London. His large debts to Matilda's father were forgiven, and he was confirmed Earl of Essex, Sheriff too of Essex, Hertfordshire, Middlesex and London. After Queen Matilda's push into London later that year, he had become one of the first to reaffirm his allegiance to Stephen, bolstering the Queen's efforts at restoring the authority of her husband, still imprisoned at that time. Geoffrey even fought at the rout of Winchester on the Blessington's side. Yet in 1143, it seems Stephen doubted the loyalty of Geoffrey in particular, perhaps seeing how easily such a powerful figure could be compelled to switch his allegiances. In truth, Geoffrey was no less loyal than most magnates of the time, having merely adjusted to the apparent political reality after Lincoln. Like Stephen's arrest of the bishops, an event covered earlier in our story, Geoffrey held key locations. In an atmosphere reminiscent of the bishops' arrests in 1139, the Jester Stephani records a rumour that Geoffrey once again tended to side with the Empress. The true catalyst for Stephen's arrest of Geoffrey may simply have been disappointment. Geoffrey held one of the key defensive positions in the kingdom. London in particular had proved loyal and instrumental in his rise to the crown in 1135, so its quick capitulation in 1141, while stiffer resistance existed in Kent, may have rankled with the king. Whatever the true motives, Geoffrey was arrested at Stephen's court at St Albans. This act of breach of trust shocked Henry of Huntingdon, describing it as, quote, an act more fitting the Earl's deserts than public right, more expedient than just. Holding Geoffrey and under threat of hanging him, the king demanded he hand over the key fortifications of the Tower of London, Saffron Walden and Pleshy, castles that the Jester Stephani points out were key strongholds surrounding London. Geoffrey, upon release, unsurprisingly rebelled in an attempt to recover his property. Geoffrey chose as his base of operations the difficult terrain of fenlands around Ely. He seized Ramsey Abbey, fortified it, calling to Henry of Huntingdon, quote, turning the house of God into a den of thieves. Such scornful derision is hardly surprising, given he had turfed out the monks present there. From here, the Earl attacked royal estates with vigour. He pillaged Cambridge with its royal castle. Monasteries were set upon, with various places sacked and set alight. Geoffrey's targets in the area were specifically royal estates, yet Stephen was not idle in responding either. He spent time building a screening network of castles between Geoffrey and London. Geoffrey had allied with Hugh Bigard, the most powerful regional magnate, as well as others, holding the island castles of Ely and Aldrich, the latter not being identified. One of Stephen's projects was Burwell Castle, a reinforcing structure to the king's existing castle at Cambridge. The land used to construct Burwell was in possession of one of Geoffrey's bases, Ramsey Abbey. Looking to disrupt its construction, Geoffrey launched an assault on it in September of 1144. Surveying the attack without his helmet, the rebel earl was shot by a lowly crossbowman in the head. At first he waved off the wound as minor, but it proved mortal, as you might expect. He was taken away to nearby Milden Hall, likely in an attempt to reach the safety of his ally Hugh Bigard of Thetford, but he died on September 26, 1144, thus removing a dangerous opponent for King Stephen. The Angevins had not really played any significant role in events. For Stephen, his eastern campaign against Geoffrey was nothing less than a great success. He had removed a proven traitor, at least in his own mind anyway, and had more importantly gained key castles, including the Tower, and had reinforced his own damaged reputation by defeating a powerful opponent in the Earl of Essex. On the flip side, his arrest on pretty flimsy grounds did not foster the kind of trust and loyalty that was essential during a time of civil war. Some leading men may have wondered, even whispered among themselves about who was next, and with a ready-made opponent entrenched in the west, this was not the greatest approach from the royal faction. Overall, however, these years between 1142 and 44 were ones of ascension and hope for the Blessingtons. On Christmas Eve of 1143, while dealing with Geoffrey's rebellion, Stephen was boosted by news of the death of Miles of Gloucester, a key figure for the Angevin cause. Miles had proved a loyal supporter, having personally escorted the Empress to Winchester and escaped the carnage. He suggested she move to Oxford in 1142, and while there she gave him Hereford and its earldom. By the final year of his life, however, he was short of funds to pay his men, had invaded the Bishop of Hereford's lands to make up the shortfall, thus prompting his excommunication. He met his end while hunting, having been shot by a stray arrow that had been meant for a stag. Given his recent plundering of church lands, this was seen by some as a divine judgment for his crimes. In the north, Ranulf of Chester was proving himself as troublesome as ever. Ranulf had been present at the rout, but had been among those who had broken away, fleeing to Chester. In 1144, Stephen, likely wishing to settle an older score with the magnate, headed to Lincoln. Bizarrely, and likely to the horror of the king and his men, the siege didn't go very well. Stephen's men were preparing a siege tower when it randomly collapsed on 80 of his troops, killing all of them through suffocation in a trench. Perhaps writing Lincoln off as a cursed enterprise, given his earlier defeat in 1141, the king abandoned the siege. In the Norman theatre, the Angevin cause was very much alive and well, with Geoffrey of Anjou finally taking Rouen in January of 1144. He was formally invested in Rouen Cathedral in the summer of that year, and was later formally recognised as Duke by his nominal overlord, King Louis VII. The Empress Matilda's husband was now undisputed ruler of Normandy in the name of their son, who would himself eventually inherit the title in 1150, and that son, her eldest, Henry Fitz-Empress, was fast maturing into adulthood. The year of 1144 had been one of considerable trouble for King Stephen. The sons of Earl Robert, as well as John the Marshal, battled him in the south of England. Stephen de Mandeville, an ally of Baldwin de Redbeers, Earl of Devon, was also fighting to strengthen Angevin control over another part of the West Country. Robert of Gloucester had built 3 counter-castles to contest the royal one at Malmesbury. However, Stephen moved to successfully relieve the garrison there. Stephen, hoping to capitalise on this small success, moved on to besiege Tetbury in Gloucestershire, even taking the Outer Bailey and moving siege engines forward. Robert, though, moved with a force of his own, including Welsh infantry and Roger, Earl of Hereford, the son of the recently deceased Miles of Gloucester. At Tetbury, a battle seemed likely, but after his capture at Lincoln and near capture at Wilton, Stephen thought better of it, instead withdrawing to Winchcombe and besieging this castle of the Earl of Hereford. Part of the garrison fled at the Blessington approach. Stephen resolutely moved to attack the remainder, sending in waves of arrow shot, while ordering his men to advance at a crawl up the motte to attack the keep. As with other attacks, it seems surprise had served Stephen well, where a prolonged siege had not. Winchcombe was now a Blessington stronghold. This campaign proved mildly successful, the king building a series of castles in Gloucestershire. Yet not content with these gains, the king showed why he has a reputation as an energetic campaigner. Hugh Bigard, an ally of the recently defeated Geoffrey de Mandeville and rebel of the Norfolk area, was surprised by the king in a lightning dash into his lands. Stephen's men captured a number of Bigard's knights, constructed 3 royal castles within his lands. Meanwhile, royal forces faced a new threat from another notable Angevin supporter, William Peveril. Peveril had held Dover for Robert early on in the war, but now sought to establish himself more firmly in Angevin territory by building his own stronghold at Cricklade. With a force of mercenaries and archers, William then began to ravage royalists along the Thames in ambushes and night attacks. One major event in 1145 was the taking of Farringdon Castle. Farringdon was the brainchild of Robert, Earl of Gloucester, and he had poured many Angevin men, support and resources into the project. Intended to project control onto Malmesbury, and perhaps regain the forward momentum to Wallingford, the frontier of Angevin territory, the men assigned to it were said to be the best of the Angevin army. Stephen resolved to attack this new stronghold, and appealed for support from London. He mustered his own force at Oxford, including a large contingent of London militia, and marched to Farringdon, beginning his own counter-castle to protect his men. Unlike at Tetbury, now Robert was reluctant to fight the royalists, hoping for reinforcements. Stephen went in for the kill, setting up siege engines around Farringdon, pounding the defences relentlessly, as well as shooting constant volleys of arrows. Men were also ordered to scale the castle ramparts, killing many defenders in their attacks. This ferocity proved too much for the Angevins inside, and a secret deputation was sent out to agree surrender terms. Sieges appeared to be King Stephen's thing, for Farringdon gained him a key stronghold, as well as arms, booty and profit from the ransoms. Farringdon was seen by chroniclers at the time as a major turning point of the conflict. It certainly disheartened the Angevins and swung the advantage decisively towards the Royalists. One shocking result, for Robert at least, was the significant defection of his own son Philip to the king's cause. Philip is regarded by the sources as a decent soldier and had even been largely behind his father's designs for constructing Farringdon to begin with. Yet it seems the young man's confidence was shaken and he had made some kind of deal with Stephen, perhaps seeing his father's support in defending the castle as insufficient. Yet treachery was not Robert's lot alone. 1145 also saw the rebellion of Turgis of Avranches. The king had placed this man in Saffron Walden following its seizure from Geoffrey de Mandeville. Turgis, though, had brazenly refused entry to Stephen, thus infuriating the king. Turgis, however, would not long enjoy the fruits of this betrayal. While hunting outside of the castle, he was confronted by a party of knights, with Stephen stood angrily in their midst. In contrast to the popular image of Stephen as some affable figure, on this occasion he threatened to hang Turgis in chains from the entrance of the castle if it wasn't surrendered. Turgis did so. Back west, the Angevins had a small victory in capturing Walter de Pinkany, Castellan of Malmesbury. As with Turgis, he too had been caught outside his charge by the men of William Peverell. The Empress herself pressured him to hand over the place, but he refused. Upon hearing of this, Stephen moved west to reinforce Malmesbury. The wretched Walter, though, was left to be tortured on Matilda's orders in a filthy dungeon. 1146 saw another major player, Ranulph of Chester, come to terms with the king. This was likely prompted by the continuing, if gradual, successes of the Royalists in general. With his lands coming under attack from Welsh raids, the irascible Earl obviously considered Stephen better protector than Matilda. A meeting was arranged at Stamford, where Ranulph, along with a small retinue, agreed in accord. With Stephen bled of funds through constant years of war, Ranulph offered to contribute monetarily to a Welsh campaign. He and Stephen did recover Bedford. Next, they made another ambitious attempt to seize Wallingford, Ranulph supporting with 300 horse. It was after this that relations unfortunately collapsed. Stephen refused, on advice, to commit to any push into Wales. On consideration, this was probably wise, given the terrain of the country. The time was one of ambushes and treachery already, and to accomplish such a push would involve entering Ranulph's lands. Another bone of contention may have been Ranulph's conduct within those considerable territories he directly controlled. According to some, the prickly Earl controlled as much as a third of England. Ranulph had been acting in these territories not so much as a vassal, but as a king, collecting taxes and not forwarding them to the royal exchequer. From Ranulph's perspective, he had rendered troops and service for very little in return, so that when Stephen and his advisers demanded hostages for his conduct going on, he bluntly refused. Inevitably, as with the bishops in 1139 and Geoffrey de Mandeville in 1143, accusations of plots and treachery began to be voiced against Ranulph. At Northampton, Stephen struck by arresting the Earl. Ranulph was chained and held at Northampton until he relented in giving up major castles, including Lincoln. This seems to be the moment when Stephen could no longer claim justification for his arrest. Of all his arrests, those of 1139 and 1143, this would prove the least justified and most damaging, though Ranulph, with little choice, relented. He gave in, but had done little to provoke Stephen's actions. From what we can tell, Ranulph's allegiance to Stephen in 1146 was genuine. Ranulph's men and his lands began to act even before his release against the king's agents. Once free, Ranulph predictably declared once more for the Empress. Stephen had regained Lincoln and some castles, but had made a new, deadly enemy. Ranulph moved to take back Lincoln, but was repulsed with much blood. He similarly tried to recover the castle at Coventry, even building another counter-castle nearby, though Stephen marched to its relief. In the fighting, the king was wounded, though not seriously. Upon Ranulph's revolt, the king seized his nephew, the Earl of Hertford, Gilbert Fitzrichard. Gilbert had been a royalist and received his promotion earlier in the king's reign. His familial relation, and also likely his own possession of castles, obviously put him in Stephen's book of paranoia. Threatening Gilbert with exile, he too relinquished his castles to the king. The result was predictable. Gilbert too joined his uncle's rebellion. Stephen tried to pin him down, but the Earl escaped, leaving his castles to Stephen's men. His castle at Pevensey did resist, though it was likely taken later. The turncoat Philip of Gloucester worked hard in the year to impress his new overlord, ambushing an Angevin Robert Moussard, who was captured and compelled to hand over his castle in Blessevin style. Philip also captured a bigger fish in Reginald, Earl of Cornwall, though under dubious circumstances, as Reginald had been in negotiation and under safe conduct at the time. Perhaps as a result of this bad faith, no agreement was made, but he was released. Internal dissent, though, was not a wholly Blessevin phenomenon, as in the same year Roger, Castellan of Berkeley, was captured by Walter, brother of the Earl of Hereford. Walter had Roger stripped naked and hung in chains before the castle to induce its surrender. What caused this vicious act was likely Roger's defection, or an attempt at such, given how the war was progressing. This is probable given we know Roger's niece married Philip of Gloucester, and the latter was tasked protecting the lord. In retaliation, Philip ravaged the surrounding lands before falling ill and vowing to go on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. The years of 1145 to 48 were thus incontrovertibly ones of Blessevin dominance, though Stephen could not completely crush Angevin power. 1148 saw Stephen move against Worcester. He captured the place and reduced it to ashes, but was unable to crack the men within the castle. Instead, the next year he attacked again, this time leaving 2 counter-fortifications to blockade the place. The Angevins managed to relieve Worcester, though in a small victory. The deaths of Miles of Gloucester and Geoffrey de Mandeville in recent years had undoubtedly boosted Stephen's prospects, though Ranulph's anger would not dim until 1147, the Earl unable to recover his castles lost in 1146. At Christmas 1146, Stephen rubbed salt into the wound by demanding a crown wearing in the castle there. On October 31st of 1147, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, died suddenly at Bristol. He was succeeded by his son William, though he was not to prove as formidable a champion, the death proving decisive. Yet even though the Angevin cause in England looked bleak at best, small glimmers of hope remained. In the same year, a very young Henry Fitz-Empress, son of Geoffrey and Matilda, invaded with a small mercenary force, though it failed largely because the young pretender lacked any funds to pay his men. Surprisingly, it was King Stephen who stepped in to pay the costs of the men, though why exactly is somewhat of a mystery. Maybe Stephen, even at this point, was considering a diplomatic path to peace, if not quite the succession agreement later reached in 1153. 1148 saw an effective end of the Matildine phase of the conflict, with the Empress herself departing, as it turns out for good, to Normandy, which was now under the control of her husband. Matilda would live on until 1167, settling in Rouen, though her part in the succession struggle was now largely over. Up until now the war had been focused on the rights of Matilda, but post-1148 the Angevin cause centres firmly around her eldest son. Though with hindsight we know Henry and his mother were triumphant, during the final phases of the conflict, purely military victory was not forthcoming. In fact, if anything, Henry's military exploits in England before 1153 could most aptly be described as humiliating. He had accompanied his uncle Robert of Gloucester in 1142, perhaps remained for several years. Another visit between the mid-1140s and 1147 was in response to repeated calls for aid to Geoffrey from England. 1147 saw the young pretender land with a small force, only to be humiliated by the king he sought to supplant. Perhaps this was Stephen's intent in paying Henry's expenses. He did this not as some kind act for an extended and royal member of his family, but as a very public show of dominance. This son of the Empress was of so little account that he could pay off the few men who had accompanied him as a mere nuisance. Henry may have actually secretly appealed directly to the king for monetary aid, both his mother and uncle unwilling to foot the costs. If so, Stephen may have seen the cost, a small measure to remove this young pretender from the theatre of war. In the spring of 1149, a fresh-faced and steely-eyed young Henry stepped ashore for the 4th time. After landing, Henry headed for Devizes, his mother's former stronghold, where he contacted several pro-Angevin leaders, including the Earls of Cornwall and Salisbury, and he immediately began acting the part of the rightful monarch of England, and not merely as a foreign duke in waiting. But Henry's main concern this time was not merely military action. The 16-year-old's intent was symbolic. He knew he wouldn't be taken seriously as a major magnate, let alone a contender for the English throne, unless he were knighted. The trip was also likely an attempt to put out feelers too to the main players in England to see how Angevin prospects looked. Henry succeeded in moving north to Carlisle, and on 22nd of May 1149 was knighted by his great uncle David, King of Scots. While there, Henry seemingly achieved his other objective too, contacting Ranulph, Earl of Chester. Significantly too, the Earl of Chester finally made his peace with his long-term enemy David, and was rewarded with the return of Lancaster. With this new honour bestowed upon him, and with an earl and a group of young and enthusiastic supporters surrounding him who had also been knighted alongside him, Henry moved south to take up the cause proper. On the way through, he avoided no less than 3 attempted ambushes set by Eustace, son and heir of King Stephen. Before this, he escaped Stephen's clutches at York, but also the efforts of Eustace while riding through Herefordshire and Gloucester. Enraged by this failure, Eustace began setting the land ablaze, destroying already harvested crops and dooming many peasants to a grim fate. Henry meanwhile briefly headed into Devon and captured Bridport, before being recalled to Devizes. The wrath of Eustace had fallen on the stronghold, with him similarly burning and razing all the surrounding houses and buildings, and even successfully overcoming the outer defences. Henry responded with characteristic intensity and speed, his reinforcements overcoming Eustace's attack. The deeds of Stephen informs us that, quote, "They began to make violent assaults on the enemy, and resolutely and irresistibly drive them back with the edge of the sword, furiously bringing down men and horses, whirling weapons, flights of arrows." The war over the throne had truly moved on to the next generation, no longer a matter contested between Matilda and Stephen, the former around 46 and the latter 10 years older, but a rivalry between Henry and Eustace. However, the military stalemate that had characterised the war in the later years of the mid to late 1140s endured, with Henry unable to advance further into Stephen's territory despite relieving Devizes. With insufficient troops, the young pretender could only launch small-scale raids. Simply put, for Henry the time was not right, and he could only make the final push for his birthright when he could be surer of success. But although on the surface the contest for the throne appeared deadlocked once more, events would tip fortune's scales firmly into Henry's favour. He withdrew back to Normandy at the beginning of 1150. Now he was knighted and bloodied in battle. Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou and Conqueror of Normandy, decided the time was right to promote his eldest son to his inheritance, and, as always intended, he resigned his title of Duke in favour of Henry, a significant boost to his son's larger ambitions. The only stumbling block to be overcome was the official stamp of approval from Henry's new nominal overlord, King Louis VII of France. Louis had returned from crusade in November of 1149, and Henry's mother, the Empress Matilda, had negotiated with him throughout 1150, her purpose being the official recognition of Henry as Duke of Normandy, but also Louis's recognition of Henry as heir to the Kingdom of England, and not Eustace, the son of Stephen. To digress slightly, the rise of Eustace throughout the 1140s had added a new vigour and dimension in and of itself to the Blessington cause. Clearly, if Stephen was serious, permanently stamping his authority over England, his successor would have to be universally accepted. To this end, Stephen began to bolster Eustace's position as heir, the latter increasingly involving himself in the battles of the period. In 1147 the king knighted his son, already having him do homage before for Normandy, and even gave up his and his wife's own rights to Boulogne to make Eustace count there. Looked at in this context, we can now see why Eustace was so determined in hunting Henry in 1149. The key, back in Normandy, to having Henry recognised as Duke and heir in England was persuading Suger, the aged abbot of St. Denis and regent of France while Louis was absent. He had the ear of the king, despite lobbying from Stephen and his brother Henry, the duplicitous Bishop of Winchester. Suger ultimately sided with Matilda's faction and urged Matilda and Geoffrey to approach the King of France directly on the issue. Henry and Geoffrey duly travelled to Paris in early summer of 1151. Suger was right and a compromise was forged, with the Angevins ceding the Norman Vexin region to Louis in return for recognition of Henry as Duke of Normandy. This triumph, though, was to be tinted with tragedy. Geoffrey would not live long to see his son fully assume the mantle of power himself, as he developed a fever on their return journey south and died in September of 1151. But the death also elevated his son yet further. In a short space of time, Henry had been promoted fast, firstly from the heir of a count to Duke of Normandy, and now Count of both Anjou and Maine. Yet if Henry was dazzled by his rise to power in 1151, then 1152 would eclipse even his wildest ambitions, given his union with the richest heiress in Europe, and, scandalously, until recently before that point, the long-term wife of his nominal overlord, the King of France. Meanwhile, King Louis's relationship with his queen was strained to say the least. Louis's father, the sixth of his name, arranged the marriage of his son to the rich heiress of Duke William X of Aquitaine in 1137. However, the union was plagued by personal differences. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the high-spirited and fiercely intelligent wife of Louis, was wholly unimpressed and ill-suited to him, once famously proclaiming that she had fought to marry a king, but ended up wedding a monk. The marriage also failed to produce a male heir, with tensions reaching boiling point during the couple's crusade. Her reputation was also sullied by accusations of an incestuous affair with her uncle Raymond, ruler of Antioch, though such accusations were never proven. Yet with only 2 daughters to show for 15 years of marriage, the union was annulled on 11th of March 1152. Eleanor at a stroke became the most eligible bride in Europe, holding vast lands in Aquitaine and other areas. She was also around 30 years of age in 1152, so still fertile, although the lack of a male heir in her previous marriage was probably food for thought for any potential suitor. But if this was an issue, her potential suitors clearly hadn't received that message. Freed from the monkish Louis, Eleanor moved towards her own lands in Poitou. However, this was no simple task, given that any man who could take and marry her could lay claim to her vast lands. Theobald, the new Count of Blois, indeed attempted such an abduction, as did Henry, Duke of Normandy's younger brother Geoffrey. Yet Eleanor eluded them both, and after she arrived at Poitiers, she met Geoffrey's elder brother, and, scandalously, the two were married on 18th of May 1152, just weeks after a separation from Henry's nominal overlord, King Louis. For Henry, the medieval superstar of the day, the match was a no-brainer. He had already very quickly gained possession of the Duchy of Normandy in 1151, then his father's lands, Maine and Anjou, shortly after that, and now he claimed Aquitaine, as well as other lands in right of his wife, which theoretically gave him more land in France than the King of France himself. Henry's meteoric rise was stunning, but had also created a deadly and powerful new enemy in King Louis. With these acquisitions and Henry's good claim to the throne of England across the Channel, the marriage tipped Louis over the edge. He immediately forged a deadly alliance with other nobles nervous of Henry's rise. Louis married his daughters by Eleanor, Marie and Alex, then aged 7 and 2 respectively, to 2 brothers, Henry, Count of Champagne, and Theobald, Count of Blois. Louis also brought other disgruntled men into his orbit, including Geoffrey, Henry Plantagenet's own younger brother, as well as Henry's rival for the English throne Eustace, son of the incumbent King Stephen. The angry reaction to his marriage reached Henry in July, as he was readying himself for another foray into England to press his claims there. In the event, the opposition proved a puff of smoke, with Henry simply marching his already assembled force southwards to disperse his enemies, including his own brother Geoffrey, who had pledged to raise revolt in Anjou. The Alliance army retreated before he had even entered Anjou itself. The writing was on the wall for the vassals there, a stark choice between an under-resourced Geoffrey on the one hand, and a powerful and angry count with an army at his back on the other. The rising was thus diffused, with Henry instead pressing himself on his new vassals in Aquitaine, with a tour of the duchy throughout the autumn of 1152. Thus was cemented one of the most celebrated marriages of the medieval era, as well as the foundation of arguably the single greatest royal dynasty in English history that would eventually rule the kingdom from Henry's accession in 1154 all the way to the Battle of Bosworth Field some 331 years later. Henry Fitz-Empress invaded England again on 6th of January 1153, determined to force his dominance over what he regarded as his birthright. For much of the war, the Blessington camp had held the upper hand, as we've seen. However, much had changed throughout the early 1150s. Henry, as the Empress Matilda's eldest child and heir, was the rising superstar of his day, controlling more of France than the French king himself, he was Duke of Normandy and Aquitaine, could now call upon men and resources to press his claims to the ultimate prize of England itself. Henry's force of 3,000 foot and around 140 knights arrived in an England whose magnates were growing heartedly sick of the never-ceasing conflict. Many, like Ranulph de Guernon, the Earl of Chester, and nominally in the Angevin camp, and Roger de Beaumont, the Earl of Leicester and a Blessevin, had made bilateral agreements to mitigate the effects, pledging only to attack with reduced forces if ordered to by their respective overlords, and returning any lands that they seized to each other. Much like during the period of King Henry I's early reign, many lords held lands in both England and Normandy, and it was better to have an overlord who controlled both domains, rather than risk the wrath of subsequent dispossession that came with two conflicting lords. Henry was the obvious candidate as a unified overlord, given his youth, power, pedigree. Unlike Stephen, always preferred heir Eustace, Henry had a clear legitimate descent from King Henry as his grandson, and the son of the Empress Matilda. This growing consensus was also enhanced by the Church's refusal to crown Eustace as his father's junior king designated heir. Clearly then the stars were aligning for Henry as he confronted his rival Stephen February at Malmesbury. However, foul weather intervened, with freakish heavy rain and snow preventing any engagement, though the encounter was significant. Several of Stephen's hitherto loyal magnates, most notably the Earl of Leicester, defected to Henry. This encounter was a breakthrough, opening up the Midlands region to Henry, who proceeded to march north and east, accepting the surrender of both Warwick and Bedford castles, enhancing his numbers to Stephen's detriment. Yet, it was at Wallingford, around the late July, early August time, that the decisive moment came. Wallingford was a key Angevin stronghold, holding out loyally since 1139, so Henry's response was natural, given any hesitance in its relief would betray weakness on his part. According to the deeds of Stephen, the two armies faced each other across the river. However, Wallingford was not to be the scene of some climactic and savage battle. The magnates on both sides had simply had enough. Since neither host was willing to risk a potentially costly battle, Henry and Stephen were forced to negotiate, yet it was clear who held all the advantages. The talks were smoothed with the assistance of the returned Archbishop Theobald, who had fled after refusing to crown Eustace a few months before, as well as Henry, Bishop of Winchester, who was arguably the man most directly responsible for both Stephen's initial seizure of the crown to begin with, and the Empress Matilda's close seizure of it in early to mid 1141. The draft agreement that was forged essentially agreed that Stephen should remain king for the rest of his life, but Henry Fitz-Empress, and not Eustace, should be his heir. Upon learning this, Eustace withdrew furiously from his father's court and headed for Cambridgeshire, where he sacked the abbey at Bury St Edmunds, whilst also burning all the crops, devastating the land all around. Fortunately for Henry and the wider kingdom, Eustace would not live long to be a further hindrance to his peaceful succession, as he died in August of 1153. Stephen's next son down, William, was not made in the same mould, and, given this temperament and a glaring lack of interest or support, he was quietly overlooked, would inherit Boulogne, but not the Kingdom of England. The deal was solidified in the Treaty of Winchester on the 6th of November 1153, though in reality negotiations and several meetings probably led up to this point. In it was a return to the status quo, with all lands held by those on 1st of December 1135, that is, the last day of King Henry I's life, to be returned to them. All castles built during the period, which amounted to hundreds at this point, were to be demolished, and all hostages taken to be returned. Henry of Huntingdon writes that Stephen confirmed the succession agreement by officially adopting Henry as his adopted son and heir. Stephen repeated the terms of this agreement in his own charter made at Westminster in December of 1153. Stephen remained king, but Henry in turn did homage to Stephen as his designated heir. Stephen's own surviving son William in turn did homage to Henry for his lands, including in Boulogne. Stephen retained custody of key strongholds, namely the Tower, Windsor, Oxford, Lincoln, Winchester, and Southampton, which were to be handed over to Henry on his accession. So it was that the 19-year period of civil war, later known as the Anarchy, was ended. Across the channel in Rouen, a warm smile must have curled the lips of Henry's mother Matilda, who had left England in 1148, unable to take the throne for herself. but she had succeeded indirectly on behalf of her own son. It was arguably Matilda's long struggle during the 1140s that laid the groundwork for Henry's eventual success in 1153. If the struggle had been foregone, if she had not physically pressed her own claims beginning in 1139 and garnered support from such men as Robert of Gloucester and other major magnates, then Henry may have had very little support when he himself came to claim his birthright. This, of course, can be heavily debated. No doubt Geoffrey Plantagenet's conquest of Normandy in the 1140s also boosted his son's chances of his marriage to Eleanor, shooting Henry to kingly level even before his succession in 1154. Henry then had all the advantages his mother had lacked in 1135. He had an extensive network of land and connection, as well as resources to call on in France itself. Henry was also importantly male, with the right bloodline. He's being descended from both the Norman royal line from William the Conqueror, but also to the older and arguably legitimate Anglo-Saxon line through his grandmother, Queen Edith. Finally then, a compromise had been forged and a peace realised. Stephen had retained his hold on the throne, but the future now belonged to Henry. In the meantime, Stephen was far from spent, at least at the beginning of 1154, spent his time energetically moving around his kingdom. He began issuing royal writs pertaining to the southwest and moved to York, where he held an assembly of the Norman magnates. Following this, the king travelled back south to Dover to meet the Count of Flanders, and it was here that Stephen's health finally collapsed. He may have been ill before this trip, but what is known is that he died in Dover on 25th of October 1154, the cause apparently a stomach disease. His body was moved to Faversham Abbey, where he was buried along with his wife Matilda and his son Eustace. Queen Matilda, who had done so much to defend her husband's crown in the darkest days of 1141, had died herself in 1152. Stephen's death truly was the end of an era. His rapid seizure of power in December of 1154 plunged the Anglo-Norman world into nearly 2 decades of strife. Henry landed in England on December 8th, 1154, and was crowned King of England on December 19th, alongside his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine. So began the long Plantagenet era of English history, and thus ends our story on the Anarchy Period. I hope you enjoyed this detailed look into the Anarchy. Please drop a like and subscribe for more videos like these, and I shall see you next time.